I discovered my husband's betrayal on a Thursday afternoon while still dressed in a hospital gown, the paper bracelet around my wrist, a stark reminder of the surgery I'd undergone just 3 days earlier. My physical therapist, Nora, had insisted I attempt a short walk down the hospital corridor. Circulation is key to recovery, Vanessa. When my phone lit up with a notification from Archer Investments, my company's automated alert system. Congratulations on the successful property acquisition at 1428 Willow Creek Lane. I stared at the screen, my legs suddenly feeling weaker than they had during the entire painful aftermath of spinal surgery. 1428 Willow Creek Lane. My address. The Tudor-style home where I'd spent the last 12 years of my life. The house that had sheltered me through launching my investment firm, through my father's death, through the early years of marriage to Richard. Vanessa? Nora's concerned voice seemed to come from far away. You've gone white. Do you need to sit down? I nodded, gripping my IV pole with white knuckles as she guided me to a nearby chair. My mind raced through possibilities, each more implausible than the last. A system error. A duplicate address in another state. A practical joke from my tech team. But the Archer investment system didn't make those kinds of mistakes. I'd personally overseen the development of our property acquisition algorithm, the same one that had built my boutique investment firm into a silent powerhouse in Chicago's real estate market. I need my laptop, I managed to say, my mouth dry. Right now. 15 minutes later, propped up in my hospital bed with my laptop balanced on a pillow over my legs, I logged into the Archer system with trembling fingers. The acquisition was there, clear as day. 1428 Willow Creek Lane, purchased for $1.4 million, nearly $1 million less than its market value, from Richard Montgomery, listed as sole owner. Richard, my husband of 9 years. Richard, who had visited just this morning, bringing organic smoothies and promises to handle everything while I recovered. Richard, whose name should not have been the only one on our property deed. I pulled up the purchase documents, scanning them with the same meticulous attention I gave to multi-million-dollar investment contracts. There it was, Richard's signature, dated yesterday. My signature, too, only it wasn't mine. I'd been heavily sedated yesterday after a complication from surgery, barely able to recognize visitors, let alone sign legal documents. With growing detachment, I navigated through the additional documentation. The property had been listed with Elmwood Realty just 11 days ago, 2 days after I'd been admitted for emergency surgery for a ruptured disc that had threatened permanent nerve damage. The listing agent was someone named Brielle Parker. Opened another tab and searched for her. The professional headshot showed a woman in her early 30s with caramel-highlighted hair and a dazzling smile. I noted with clinical precision that she wore the exact style of teardrop earrings I'd given Richard to give me for our anniversary last year. Earrings I'd never received because they were out of stock. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. How's my brave girl doing? Meeting ran long. Will visit after dinner. Love you. I set the phone down without responding, continuing my investigation. The Archer acquisition had been handled by Marcus Chen, one of our newer analysts with a remarkable talent for spotting undervalued properties. The automated system had flagged the Willow Creek listing based on criteria I'd programmed myself: historic property, below market pricing, desirable neighborhood, motivated seller. Motivated seller. The phrase sat heavy in my stomach. I pulled up the internal messaging system and sent a direct note to Marcus. Need full background on Willow Creek purchase. Seller connection to listing agent? Any unusual circumstances noted? Priority urgent. While waiting for his response, I accessed our home security system from my laptop. Richard had insisted on the top-of-the-line smart home setup last year. For your safety when I travel, honey. I now navigated to the saved footage, selecting the master bedroom camera from 3 days ago, the day I'd gone into surgery. There was Richard, packing a suitcase. Not mine for the hospital, which he'd done in performative concern while I'd watched from the bed. No, this was his own luggage, methodically filled with his designer clothes, watches, and the framed photo of us from Santorini. The one without my grandmother's antique silver frame that had mysteriously broken last month. I fast-forwarded through footage from the last 3 days. Richard entering and exiting at odd hours. Unfamiliar moving men carefully packing specific items. His collection of first edition novels, the expensive whiskey cabinet, the artwork from his office. And yesterday afternoon, Richard and Brielle walking through the house, her hand trailing possessively along the kitchen island I'd had custom built of reclaimed walnut, her lips brushing his neck as they stood in the doorway of what had been our bedroom. My phone buzzed again with a response from Marcus. Mrs. Montgomery, seller and listing agent have personal relationship. Agent's social media shows photos together dating back 8 months. Seller claimed property available due to divorce. Settlement. Have halted final payment pending your review. Is everything all right? 8 months. The timeline aligned perfectly with Richard's investment conference schedule that had suddenly become more frequent, his late nights at the office, his insistence that I focus on building Archer rather than worrying about the household. I closed my eyes, allowing myself exactly 30 seconds to feel the tsunami of emotions: betrayal, humiliation, rage. Then, with the same discipline that had built a $50 million investment company from my $100,000 inheritance, I compartmentalized. I messaged Marcus back, "Hold payment, continue as if normal, share details with no one, will handle personally." I had allowed Richard to handle everything while I focused on my recovery. Now I understood exactly what everything entailed. As I steeled myself for what came next, I recalled something my father had told me when teaching me chess as a child. The most dangerous position on the board, Vanessa, is when your opponent believes you don't see the trap they've set. And Richard had no idea I could see the entire board. My relationship with 1428 Willow Creek Lane had begun long before Richard entered my life. The ivy-covered Tudor with its distinctive peaked gables and leaded glass windows represented far more than brick and mortar. It was the physical manifestation of my promise to my father. A promise made in his final days as cancer ravaged his once formidable frame, when he'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Build something that will outlast you, Nessa." I'd purchased the dilapidated property when it was barely habitable, using the modest inheritance he'd left. The remains of a once substantial fortune lost to poor investments and medical bills. At 28, with an MBA and 4 years of experience at a cutthroat investment firm, I'd seen potential where others saw only decay. The historic property had been the perfect metaphor for the business I planned to build. Solid bones, distinguished lineage, requiring vision and determination to restore to greatness. Each renovation had come from the profits of Archer Investments, my boutique firm specializing in strategic property acquisition. The hand-carved newel post on the grand staircase commemorated our first $1 million deal. The slate roof replaced after our 5th year. The state-of-the-art kitchen installed after I landed the Westbrook portfolio. Every corner of the house chronicled my rise from ambitious daughter of a failed businessman to the CEO of a company that managed over $50 million in assets. Richard had appeared in my life during what I now recognized as the dangerous euphoria of early success. He'd been charming, attentive, impressed by my accomplishments without seeming intimidated. After a lifetime of men who either competed with me or felt diminished by my ambition, Richard's apparent admiration had been intoxicating. "You're remarkable," he'd said on our 3rd date, standing in the partially renovated living room of Willow Creek. "Most people inherit legacy. You're building yours brick by brick." We'd married in the gardens behind the house once they were finally landscaped. I'd added his name to some of the property documents but had maintained primary ownership, a detail he'd apparently managed to obscure or falsify in the recent sale. The legal implications sent my mind racing down complex pathways, but I forced, myself to focus on the emotional violation first. Understanding the full scope of betrayal would provide the foundation for an appropriate response. I scrolled through more security footage, my body tensing as I watched Richard and Brielle move through my home with the casual intimacy of longtime lovers. They paused in my home office, Richard opening the built-in safe behind my degrees and awards, the safe only he and I knew about. I immediately checked my digital banking app. The joint account we maintained for household expenses was nearly empty. Not unusual given Richard's recent insistence on handling the bills during my medical crisis. My personal accounts appeared untouched, as did my investment portfolios. Either he hadn't gotten that far yet, or he'd calculated that tampering with Archer Investments would trigger too many alarms. He'd been right about that at least. What he hadn't anticipated was that selling my house to my own company would set off the same alerts. A soft knock at the hospital door interrupted my investigation. Dr. Patel entered, her expression concerned as she took in my impromptu workstation. "Vanessa, your blood pressure is elevated and you've missed your medication schedule," she admonished, checking the monitors beside my bed. "Recovery from spinal surgery requires rest and stress reduction. Whatever this is," she gestured at my laptop. "It can wait. I'm afraid it can't, Anita," I replied, using her first name deliberately. We'd known each other since college, and her referral had brought several physician clients to Archer. "Richard is selling our house out from under me while I'm confined to this bed." Her professional demeanor faltered. "What? That's not possible. Legally, I mean." Apparently, forged signatures make many impossible things possible. I turned the laptop to show her the documents. "The ironic twist is that my own company purchased it. The universe has a dark sense of humor." Anita's expression hardened as she examined the evidence. "This is criminal, Vanessa. We should call the police." "Not yet," I said, a plan already forming. "First, I need to understand exactly what he's done and what he plans to do next. Also, I need your help with something else." "Name it." "I need to be discharged tomorrow instead of next week." Anita shook her head. "Absolutely not. Your surgery was major, and that complication yesterday." "I can recover at the Four Seasons," I interrupted. "Hire a private nurse, but I need mobility and privacy for what comes next." She studied me, likely recognizing the expression I wore during difficult negotiations. "Let me be clear. You've just had invasive spinal surgery. Moving around too soon could cause permanent damage. And what would you suggest, Anita? That I lie here while my husband of 9 years sells everything I've built?" Her shoulders slumped slightly. "I'll arrange for additional home care and equipment. But you'll need to follow strict protocols, and at the first sign of complications, you're coming back here immediately." Agreed. My laptop pinged with another notification, a secure message from Eliza, my second-in-command at Archer, who'd been overseeing operations during my absence. "Unusual property acquisition flagged for review. System shows your home address? Call me ASAP." I typed a quick response. "Handling personally. Need complete background on Brielle Parker of Elmwood Realty. Also, gather team for emergency meeting tomorrow, 4 p.m. My suite at Four Seasons. Discretion essential." As Anita adjusted my medication, I continued piecing together Richard's scheme, reviewing our combined financial records with increasing clarity. The patterns emerged like stars becoming visible at twilight: small withdrawals from joint accounts, the gradual removal of valuable items from the house, his sudden interest in our insurance policies and investment paperwork. Richard hadn't just been planning to leave me. He'd been methodically extracting himself and as many assets as possible, timing his exit to coincide with my greatest physical vulnerability. The house was just the largest piece in his carefully orchestrated disappearing act. "You know," Anita said quietly as she checked my surgical site, "in medical school they taught us that pain exists for a reason. It's the body's warning system." I met her eyes, understanding the metaphor. "And what do you do with warnings?" You listen to them, she replied, and then you address the cause, not just the symptom. As she left, I returned to my investigation with renewed focus. Richard had unknowingly given me everything I needed to dismantle his scheme, starting with selling my most precious asset to the very company I had built to protect it. The brewing. Deception became clearer as I methodically reviewed the past several months through the unforgiving lens of hindsight. My laptop balanced precariously on the hospital bed tray as I created a detailed timeline, cross-referencing Richard's increasingly suspicious behavior with bank statements, property documents, and my own meticulously kept digital calendar, January. Richard had suggested I simplify by consolidating our important documents. He'd offered to organize everything in a new cloud storage system, claiming it would give me peace of mind if anything happened to either of us. I'd given him access to my personal document safe, containing everything from the original Willow Creek deed to my grandfather's vintage watch collection, items now conspicuously absent from the security footage. February, the frequent business. Trips had begun. Richard, whose work as a financial consultant had always involved some travel, suddenly found himself indispensable to clients in Boston, where Brielle Parker had previously worked according to her LinkedIn profile. The receipts I found buried in our shared cloud storage showed hotel charges for 2, spa services, and jewelry purchases that had never made their way to my jewelry box. March. He'd convinced me to grant him access to manage the household accounts, while I focused on Archer's expansion into commercial real estate. "You're making strides, Vanessa," he'd said, massaging my shoulders as I reviewed acquisition projections late one night. "Let me handle the mundane so you can focus on the extraordinary." The account statements now showed a pattern of transfers to an unfamiliar entity labeled Montgomery Consulting LLC, a company I'd never heard of, but which had been registered in Delaware 3 months earlier. April. The accidental damage to family heirlooms began. My grandmother's antique silver picture frames, my father's collection of rare first editions, the hand-blown Murano glass vase from our honeymoon, all mysteriously broken, with Richard appearing devastated by each incident. "I'll handle the, insurance claims," he'd insisted. The claims had indeed been filed, with the payouts directed to an account I couldn't access. May. As spring bloomed, Richard had suggested renovating the master suite. "You work so hard, you deserve a sanctuary," he'd insisted, temporarily relocating us to the guest bedroom while contractors tore apart our personal space. Now I understood it had been a convenient way to disrupt our living arrangements, making it easier to slowly remove his possessions without my noticing. It also explained why he'd been so insistent on designing a new walk-in closet with individual sides. His side could be emptied without disturbing mine. And finally, early June, my unexpected medical emergency. What had begun as persistent back pain escalated dramatically one evening, resulting in a rushed ambulance ride and emergency surgery for a herniated disc that threatened permanent nerve damage. The timing now seemed suspiciously convenient. Richard had been particularly solicitous in the weeks prior, ensuring I rested instead of going into the office, encouraging my dependence on him, and isolating me from colleagues under the guise of helping me focus on healing. My phone buzzed with a message from Eliza. "Background on Parker complete. Sending secure file now." She's worked at 3 agencies in 5 years, all with suspicious patterns of undervalued sales to private buyers. Known for specialized divorce relocations. Previous complaint filed, but dropped. I opened the attached file, absorbing details about Brielle Parker's career with growing certainty that she was more than just Richard's mistress. She was his accomplice. Her specialty in divorce relocations appeared to be helping soon-to-be ex-spouses liquidate shared assets before legal proceedings began. The pattern was distinct. Properties sold quickly, below market value, often while one spouse was conveniently absent. I switched back to the security footage, Fast forwarding to yesterday evening. Richard entered the house with Brielle, both laughing as they carried takeout containers and wine into the kitchen, my kitchen, with the custom island I'd designed to match the original architectural details of the house. "Tomorrow it's official," Richard said, his voice perfectly audible through the high-end security system he'd insisted on installing. "Closing goes through and we're free." Brielle raised her wine glass. "To perfect timing and clean getaways." "And to Vanessa's predictable dedication to her precious company," Richard added with a smirk that sent ice through my veins. So focused on Archer, she never noticed what was happening in her own home. "How long before she's discharged?" Brielle asked, perching on a bar stool, my bar stool in my kitchen. "At least another week, then 6 weeks of limited mobility. By then we'll be settled in the Caymans." He pulled her close, kissing her neck. "The offshore accounts are set up. Once the house money clears, we'll have more than enough to disappear properly." My fingers clenched around my phone, the urge to call Richard immediately nearly overwhelming. But tactical patience had built my business, and it would serve me now. I needed to understand the full scope of his plan before making my move. I texted Marcus again. "Need complete documentation of purchase process for Willow Creek." "Who did Richard list as his attorney for the transaction? Any mention of offshore transfers for the payment?" While waiting for his response, I created a secure folder titled Operation Homecoming and began organizing evidence. Screenshots of the security footage, financial records showing Richard's methodical siphoning of assets, documentation of the falsified property sale. The hospital room door opened and a nurse entered with my evening medication. I quickly minimized the screens, pasting on a bland smile. "How are we feeling this evening?" she asked, checking my vitals. "Much better," I replied, accepting the paper cup of pills. "I'm being discharged tomorrow." Her eyebrows rose. "That's not in your chart, Mrs. Montgomery. Dr. Patel is updating it. I'll be continuing recovery privately." As she left, looking concerned, my laptop pinged with Marcus's response. Richard used Lawrence and Tate for closing. Spencer Lawrence specifically. He requested expedited processing due to seller's urgent relocation needs. Payment instructions included wire transfer to First Caribbean bank account pending closing. Full documentation attached. Spencer Lawrence. Another piece clicked into place. One of Richard's college friends, a real estate attorney he'd introduced me to at several social functions. I'd even considered hiring Spencer's firm for Archer's legal work until Eliza had expressed reservations about their reputation for aggressive tactics. I opened my contacts and scrolled to a different name, Mira Patel, Anita's younger sister, and one of Chicago's most formidable divorce attorneys. We'd met at Anita's wedding, bonding over our shared experiences as women leading in traditionally male-dominated fields. "Mira," I typed, "need your expertise on an urgent and confidential matter involving fraudulent property transfer and marital asset theft. Can you come to Four Seasons tomorrow afternoon? We'll explain everything." Her response came quickly. "Clearing my schedule. 4:30 works. Should I bring my forensic accountant?" "Absolutely. And Mira, I need someone who isn't afraid to make this hurt." "Those are my favorite kinds of cases," she replied. "Rest now. Tomorrow we build the guillotine." As I set my phone down, a notification appeared from the Archer investment system. The sale of 1428 Willow Creek Lane was pending final signatures. Richard's plan was moving forward exactly as he'd orchestrated, with one critical difference. He thought he was selling my house to an anonymous corporate buyer. He had no idea he was selling it to me. The strategic pause I needed came in the form of 24 carefully calculated hours. My discharge from Northwestern Memorial Hospital had been arranged with military precision. Dr. Anita Patel personally overseeing the process, a private ambulance service waiting at the staff entrance away from public view, and a suite at the K. Four Seasons already prepared with the medical equipment necessary for my continued recovery. "The incision site looks good," Anita murmured, performing one final check before I was transferred to the wheelchair. But I'm serious about the restrictions, Vanessa. 4 hours maximum upright each day, no bending, no twisting, and the nurse stays with you at all times. Understood, I replied, though my mind was already cataloging which of those restrictions I might need to circumvent. The nurse Anita had arranged, a stern-faced woman named Helen with 20 years of experience in post-surgical care, seemed to read my thoughts. Mrs. Montgomery, I've worked with enough CEOs and politicians to recognize that look, Helen said, adjusting the wheelchair footrests. Whatever you're planning, it can be done from a reclining position with proper support. I'm not here to restrict you. I'm here to ensure you can continue your activities without re-injuring yourself. I reassessed her with new appreciation. Helen, I think we'll work well together. The ambulance ride passed in silence as I mentally prepared for the next phase. My phone remained deliberately shut off. Richard would expect communication now, that I was being discharged, but each hour of silence would increase his unease, making him more likely to make mistakes. Psychological warfare began with controlling the flow of information. By 11 that morning, I was established in the Four Seasons presidential suite, transformed into a combination recovery room and command center. The spacious living area now featured a hospital-grade adjustable bed positioned to face a wall where Eliza had arranged 3 large monitors displaying security feeds from Willow Creek, Archer's secure server access, and a dedicated screen for video conferencing. The team will be here at 4, Eliza confirmed, her efficient demeanor betraying no hint of the shock she must have felt at the situation. Marcus is bringing all documentation related to the property acquisition. Keisha from legal has prepared preliminary injunctions if needed. Jordan has the financial forensics ready for review. And this just arrived from Ms. Patel, Helen added, handing me a thick folder embossed with the Patel & Associates logo. She said to review Section 3 before your meeting. I nodded, already reaching for the folder. Has there been any activity at the house? Eliza glanced at the security feed. Richard returned briefly at 8 this morning, removed several items from your office, then left. He's attempted to call you 5 times in the last hour. Let him wonder, I murmured, opening Mira's folder to find comprehensive documentation on emergency asset freezes and fraudulent transfer statutes. Section 3 detailed the criminal implications of forging signatures on property documents, implications that carried potential prison sentences. Prison wasn't my goal. Complete and humiliating divestment was. My father's voice echoed in my memory. In business, Nessa, negotiate from strength and strike from shadows. When they see you coming, it's already too late. At precisely 1 o'clock, I finally turned on my phone, unsurprised to find 17 missed calls from Richard, along with increasingly urgent text messages. 10:05 a.m. Checking on you, brave girl. Hospital said you're being discharged? 11:23 m. Vanessa, where are you? Called Anita, but she's in surgery. Getting worried. 12:10 p.m. Please call me. I need to discuss something important about the house. 12:47 p.m. This isn't like you. Please. Confirm you're okay. Should I file a police report? The last message had come through just 10 minutes ago. I'm at the hospital. They won't tell me anything. This is ridiculous. Call me now. I composed a single, carefully worded response. Recovering privately. Need space. Will contact you when ready. His reply was immediate. Where are you? I'll come now. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned to Helen. I need to record something. Could you help me look presentable? 20 minutes later, hair smoothed into a simple chignon, minimal makeup applied, and dressed in a silk pajama set that conveyed both vulnerability and control, I sat propped against pillows while Eliza positioned the camera. Ready when you are, she said, finger poised above the record button. I took a measured breath, arranging my features into an expression of calm determination. Begin recording. Looking directly into the camera, I spoke with deliberate clarity. This statement is being recorded on June 17th at 1:45 p.m. I am Vanessa Montgomery, CEO of Archer Investments and legal owner of the property at 1428 Willow Creek Lane. I am of sound mind and under no duress or medication that would impair my judgment. I held up my hospital discharge papers. As these documents show, I have been hospitalized for emergency spinal surgery since June 8th. During this time, it has come to my attention that my husband, Richard Montgomery, has attempted to sell our shared residence without my knowledge or consent, using what appears to be a forged signature on legal documents. I continued methodically, detailing the discovery of the fraud, the timeline of suspicious activities, and the documentation I had gathered. Throughout, I maintained the same composed demeanor that had carried me through a decade of high-stakes negotiations. I am recording this statement to establish a clear timeline and to formally revoke any apparent consent to this transaction. Furthermore, I am initiating legal proceedings to protect my assets and investigate this fraudulent activity. I paused, then added the critical final piece. This statement is being witnessed by Elizabeth Chen, Chief Operating Officer of Archer Investments, and Helen Nowak, registered nurse and licensed notary public. Helen stepped forward, notary stamp in hand. I hereby witness Mrs. Montgomery's statement and verify her identity and apparent mental competence. Recording complete, Eliza said, stopping the video and immediately transferring it to a secure server. This gives us legal grounds to halt any transaction in progress, though technically we already control both sides of the sale. I nodded, setting aside the legal documents. Make 3 copies. 1 for Mira, 1 for our corporate counsel, and 1 to be delivered to Spencer Lawrence with a personal note. As Eliza drafted the note, I turned my attention to the financial documentation Marcus had prepared. The paper trail of Richard's preparations was impressively thorough. A network of carefully established accounts, strategic asset liquidation, and the beginnings of what appeared to be a comprehensive exit strategy. He's been planning this for at least 10 months, I murmured, noting the establishment date of the first offshore account. Since right after I appointed him signatory on the household accounts. Classic trust exploitation, Helen commented unexpectedly. When I glanced up in surprise, she shrugged. My previous patient was a federal prosecutor specializing in marital fraud. You hear things. My phone rang. Richard again. I silenced it without answering, adding another layer to his growing unease. The uncertainty would push him toward action, and action would make him visible. Visible targets were easier to hit. By 3 o'clock, the suite had transformed into a war room. Displays showed real-time monitoring of all accounts connected to Richard, surveillance of key locations including our home, and a detailed asset map tracking everything from property holdings to investment portfolios. He's back at the house, Eliza noted, pointing to the security feed where Richard's Mercedes had just pulled into the driveway. Another car followed, a red BMW convertible driven by Brielle Parker. And he's not alone. I watched as they entered my home, their body language, revealing a mixture of celebration and urgency. Richard immediately headed to the office safe again, removing what appeared to be passport folders and a small case. Leaving early? I murmured. I don't think so. The final pieces of my counter-strategy fell into place as I watched them move through my home with entitled familiarity. Richard had calculated everything perfectly, except for the one variable he had always underestimated. Me. The unexpected ally arrived precisely at 4:30 p.m., her entrance marked by a commanding presence that seemed to reconfigure the energy of the suite. Mira Patel stood 5'3" in her Louboutin heels, her tailored charcoal suit and sleek black bob projecting the perfect balance of professionalism and intimidation that had made her one of Chicago's most feared divorce attorneys. 14 years practicing family law, and I've never seen quite this level of calculated betrayal during a medical crisis, Mira remarked, setting her briefcase on the conference table we'd established near my adjustable bed. Though the Mistress realtor Collaboration is becoming unfortunately common. The real twist is your company buying the property. Behind her came a rail-thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the most organized briefcase I'd ever seen, compartmentalized with color-coded tabs and digital devices neatly arranged. Vanessa Montgomery, meet Devin Rhodes, Mira introduced him. The forensic accountant I mentioned. He can find money hidden in dimensions physicists haven't discovered yet. Devin nodded briskly, immediately connecting his laptop to our system. Ms. Chen briefed me on the basics. I've already started tracking the first Caribbean accounts, but offshore banking requires specialized approaches. Fortunately, your husband made several tactical errors in his concealment strategy. Such as? I asked, adjusting my position as Helen monitored my pain levels with silent vigilance. Patterns, Devin replied, his fingers flying across the keyboard. People attempting to hide assets typically maintain familiar timing sequences. Monthly, transfers on specific dates, rounded amounts, predictable percentage calculations. The human brain struggles with true randomization. While Devin worked, Mira reviewed my recorded statement and the evidence we'd compiled. The forged signature on the property documents is actually helpful for us, she noted. It transforms this from a civil dispute into potential criminal fraud, which gives us additional leverage and immediate injunctive relief. I don't want him arrested, I clarified. Not yet, anyway. I want him completely disentangled from my assets, exposed to our social circles, and removed from any position to profit from his deception. Mira smiled thinly. My favorite kind of retribution. Clean, complete, and career-ending. The suite. Door opened again as Marcus Chen arrived with the complete Willow Creek transaction files. Unlike many of my aggressive investment managers, Marcus presented as surprisingly gentle, soft-spoken with thoughtful eyes behind scholarly glasses. His appearance belied the ruthless analytical mind that had made him one of Archer's most successful. Property acquisition specialists. Mrs. Montgomery, he greeted me with obvious concern. I can't express how disturbed I am by this situation. I should have recognized the seller's name during the initial assessment. You followed the acquisition protocols perfectly, Marcus, I assured him. The system worked exactly as designed, identifying an undervalued property and notifying me of the opportunity. The fact that it was my own home is the universe's way of reminding me to maintain better personal oversight. Still, he persisted, setting down an expandable folder stuffed with documents. I spoke directly with Mr. Montgomery twice during the process, and nothing in his demeanor suggested anything unusual. He was quite convincing about the property being available due to a marital settlement. Because he believed it, I said, the realization crystallizing as I spoke. Richard doesn't know Archer was the buyer. The purchase was made through one of our standard acquisition shells. Kairos Properties, correct? Marcus nodded. Standard procedure for privacy when we're acquiring residential properties. Mira leaned forward, immediately grasping the strategic advantage. So your husband believes he sold your house to an anonymous corporate entity, with no idea he's actually sold it to your own company? Exactly, I confirmed as Eliza displayed the security feed from Willow Creek on the main monitor. And it seems he and Ms. Parker are celebrating their successful transaction right now, in my kitchen, with what appears to be my Veuve Clicquot La Grande Dame. The footage showed Richard and Brielle clinking champagne flutes, his arm draped around her waist as they surveyed the kitchen. Their lips moved, though without audio, we couldn't determine what they were saying. We need to understand his next moves, I said, turning to Devin. What are you finding in the financial trail? 3 primary accounts established in Grand Cayman, he reported, not looking up from his screen. Initial deposits began 10 months ago, small transfers that wouldn't trigger scrutiny. The pattern accelerated 3 months ago with more substantial movements. The most recent transfer was initiated yesterday, $1.4 million, which appears to be the proceeds from the house sale, minus realtor commission. Can you freeze those accounts? I asked. Not directly, Devin replied. But there's a beautiful vulnerability in his structure. He's using a sunset provision, a temporary holding account that automatically transfers to a more permanent offshore structure after a certain period. In this case, the funds sit in a holding pattern for 7 business days before final transfer. So we have a week to intercept, Mira noted, already drafting documents on her tablet. Less, Devon corrected. 5 business days remaining. After that, recovering the funds becomes significantly more complex. Marcus cleared his throat tentatively. There's something else you should know, Mrs. Montgomery. The closing documents include a 60-day occupancy clause. Mr. Montgomery negotiated the right to remain in the property for up to 2 months after closing, with prorated rent deducted from the final payment. I raised an eyebrow. So technically, Richard is now renting my house from my company without realizing it? Precisely, Marcus confirmed. As if on cue, my phone lit up with another call from Richard. This time I nodded to Eliza, who had already prepared for this moment. Put it on speaker, I instructed. Everyone silent. I answered with deliberate calm. Richard? Vanessa, thank God. His voice carried the precise notes of relief and concern that had made him so convincing over the years. I've been worried. Sick? The hospital wouldn't tell me anything. Where are you? Recovering privately, I replied, keeping my responses minimal to encourage him to fill the silence. What does that mean? I'm your husband. I should be with you. Why won't you tell me where you are? I needed space to think, Richard. A brief pause. Think about what? Vanessa, you're not making sense. The doctor said the medication might cause confusion. I'm not confused, I interrupted, my voice steady. I'm seeing quite clearly now. How's Brielle? The silence that followed contained multitudes. Shock, calculation, the rapid recalibration of his strategy. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted to something more defensive. I don't know what you're talking about. Who's Brielle? On the security monitor, we watched him step away from the woman in question, moving into the home office, my office, and closing the door behind him. Your realtor, I replied calmly. The one who helped you sell our house while I was having emergency surgery. Another weighted pause. Vanessa, I can explain everything. There's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. Richard, I received the congratulatory notification from my company about the successful acquisition of 1428 Willow Creek Lane. Apparently, you found a highly motivated buyer. I could almost hear the gears turning as he processed this information, trying to determine exactly how much I knew and how to spin it to his advantage. It's a temporary measure, he attempted, his voice regaining some confidence. The market presented an unexpected opportunity, and with your recovery requiring significant resources, I made an executive decision. I was going to surprise you with the profits once you were feeling better. How thoughtful, I replied, sharing a knowing look with Mira. And the offshore accounts in Grand Cayman? Were those also part of the surprise? His sharp intake of breath confirmed what I already knew. Richard had never respected my business acumen enough to believe I could unravel his scheme so quickly. We should discuss this in person, he finally said, his tone now carefully controlled. Where are you? I'll come to you right now. That won't be necessary, I responded. But I do have a question for you, Richard. Anything, honey. How does it feel to be caught? I ended the call before he could respond, knowing the uncertainty would unsettle him far more than any confrontation. Mira smiled with professional appreciation. Perfect. Let him stew in that for a while. On the monitor, we watched Richard emerge. From the office, his face pale as he approached Brielle with urgent gestures. Whatever he said sent her into immediate action, gathering her belongings with frantic efficiency. And now, I said, turning to my assembled team, we move to Phase 2. The deeper investigation began as darkness fell over Chicago, transforming the four-season suite into a forensic war room illuminated by the glow of multiple screens. Devin Rhodes had commandeered the dining table, surrounding himself with financial statements and 3 laptops running specialized tracking software. His methodical analysis of Richard's financial maneuvers revealed a betrayal far more extensive than I had initially suspected. "Your husband doesn't just have a mistress and a plan to sell your house," Devin explained, gesturing to a complex flowchart displayed on his center screen. "He's been systematically liquidating and transferring joint assets for nearly a year. The house was merely the final piece, the largest single asset he could access." I adjusted my position in the hospital bed, ignoring the twinge of pain as I leaned forward to study the financial web Devin had uncovered. "Show me everything." "It starts here," he said, pointing to a series of transactions from August of last year. "Small transfers from your joint household account to a previously dormant personal account in his name. Nothing suspicious initially. Amounts under $9,000. Irregular intervals. Plausible explanations if questioned." "Below the SAR reporting threshold," Mira noted, referring to the suspicious activity reports that banks were required to file for transactions over $10,000. "Exactly," Devin confirmed. "But the pattern shifts in November. That's when Montgomery Consulting LLC appears, registered in Delaware with a complex ownership structure designed to obscure the beneficial owner." Marcus, who had been quietly reviewing property documents, looked up with professional interest. "Classic layering technique. We see it in real estate shell companies all the time. The consulting company creates the appearance of legitimate business," Devin continued, highlighting another cluster of transactions. "Your husband began invoicing for financial advisory services through this entity. The invoices went to companies that don't appear to exist beyond paper registrations. Fake companies paying for fake services," I summarized, the calculated deception making my surgical pain seem distant by comparison. "But that's not all," Devin said, his tone shifting to what I recognized as professional excitement at discovering a particularly complex scheme. 3 months ago, he established a second layer, an investment group based in Nevada that began purchasing specific assets. "What kind of assets?" Eliza asked, moving closer to examine the screen. Devin's thin fingers tapped a sequence that brought up a new window. "Art, primarily, but also several vehicles, jewelry, and collectibles. Items that are portable, valuable, and, most importantly, previously owned by you jointly." The revelation sent ice through my veins as pieces clicked into place. "The insurance claims, the supposedly damaged items." Mira nodded grimly. "He wasn't just filing claims for broken valuables. He was creating paper documentation of their loss while actually relocating them to storage facilities. Facilities registered to the Nevada Investment Group," Devin confirmed. "We've identified 3 storage locations so far, all using biometric security systems registered to Richard Montgomery. On the security monitor, we watched as Richard and Brielle loaded several suitcases into their respective vehicles. Their movements conveyed urgency, the rushed steps and frequent glances toward the street suggesting they understood that their timeline had been compromised. "They're leaving earlier than planned," I observed, turning to Mira. "What are our immediate options?" "With the evidence of forgery on the property documents, we can file for emergency injunctive relief tonight," she replied, already drafting on her tablet. "Judge Harriman owes me a favor. She'll sign electronically within the hour. That freezes all accounts and assets connected to the property transaction." "What about the items he's already moved?" I asked. "That's trickier," Mira admitted. "We need court orders for each storage facility, which requires specific evidence that the contents belong to you." "Which I have," I said, reaching for my phone. "Pull up the home inventory database, Eliza. Password, Archer1428. Eliza quickly accessed the system, displaying a comprehensive digital catalog on the main screen. "You documented everything in the house?" My father taught me to treat personal assets with the same diligence as business investments, I explained. Every item valued over $500 is photographed, described, and cataloged with purchase information and appraisals where applicable. I update it quarterly. Mira's expression shifted to something approaching admiration. This changes everything. With this documentation, we can file for emergency asset recovery on all items removed from the property, while you handle the legal filings, I said to Mira. Marcus, I need you to address the property transaction itself. As Archer's acquisition specialist, what options do we have regarding the house? Marcus adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. Several, actually. Since Archer now legally owns the property, we control the occupancy terms. The 60-day clause Mr. Montgomery negotiated cuts both ways. He has the right to remain for up to 60 days, but is not obligated to stay. If he vacates voluntarily, even temporarily, we can secure the property and change access codes under standard vacancy protection protocols. Perfect, I nodded, turning to the security feed where Richard and Brielle appeared to be having a heated discussion in the driveway. I believe they're about to vacate voluntarily. Eliza enhanced the audio capture from the exterior cameras, allowing us to hear fragments of their conversation. Not safe here anymore, Richard was saying, his normally smooth demeanor fracturing under pressure. She knows something, but not everything. We need to move now. The accounts aren't fully transferred, Brielle argued, her professional facade similarly crumbling. We need at least 3 more days before… We don't have 3 days, Richard hissed, gripping her arm. You don't know Vanessa like I do. If she's figured out part of it, she won't stop until she uncovers everything. At least he'd learned that much about me over 9 years of marriage. Then we accelerate, Brielle insisted. Contact Spencer, have him push through the final transfers tomorrow. I'll handle the remaining items from the house. We meet in Miami tomorrow night instead of next week. Richard nodded, pulling her close for a brief, tense kiss. Call me when… You're on the road. Don't stay here tonight. It's not safe. Separate cars, separate routes, just like we planned, she confirmed. This is just happening sooner than expected. As their cars pulled away from Willow Creek Lane in opposite directions, I turned to my team with newfound resolve. They've just given us everything we need. Eliza, contact our security team. As soon as the property is definitively vacated, secure it completely. Marcus, prepare to execute whatever legal options maximize our control of the property. Already on it, Marcus replied, typing rapidly. I'm ordering a property condition inspection for tonight. Standard procedure when a new acquisition becomes temporarily vacant. Our security team will document everything for insurance purposes. Devin, I continued, how quickly can you trace and lock the remaining financial transfers? The forensic accountant glanced up from his screens with the faintest hint of a smile. With the evidence of forged documents, I can have temporary freezes in place within 2 hours. By morning, every account connected to Montgomery Consulting, and the Nevada entity will be inaccessible to anyone except financial crimes investigators. And speaking of investigators, Mira added, my contact at the White Collar Crimes Division would be very interested in this web of transfers, especially those designed to hide marital assets during a medical crisis. That crosses several ethical and legal boundaries that could result in serious consequences beyond the civil case. I considered this, weighing the satisfaction of legal punishment against the more immediate goal of reclaiming what was mine. Hold that option in reserve for now. First, I want to secure everything he tried to take. Then we can discuss appropriate consequences. Helen, who had been monitoring my vital signs throughout the strategy session, gently intervened. Mrs. Montgomery, you're due for pain medication and your heart rate indicates increasing discomfort. Perhaps a brief rest while your team implements these initial steps. I reluctantly acknowledged the wisdom in her suggestion, suddenly aware of the throbbing, pain radiating from my surgical site. 30 minutes, then we reconvene to assess progress. As the team dispersed to their respective tasks, I closed my eyes briefly, allowing myself to process the magnitude of Richard's betrayal. The man who had promised to stand by me in sickness and in health had instead seen my medical crisis as an opportunity for theft on a grand scale. The calculated nature of his deception, begun long before my surgery, revealed a disturbing capacity for duplicity I hadn't recognized despite my usual business acumen. Yet in his arrogance, Richard had made a fundamental miscalculation. He had seen my house as merely a valuable asset to be liquidated, not recognizing that it represented something far more significant: the physical manifestation of my promise to my father to build something lasting. By targeting Willow Creek Lane, Richard hadn't just attempted to steal property, he'd attacked the very symbol of my resilience, and I had every intention of showing him exactly how resilient I could be. The tactical response began precisely at midnight, unfolding with the same methodical precision that had built Archer Investments from a modest inheritance into a formidable market presence. While Richard and Brielle fled in separate directions, believing they maintained the upper hand, my assembled team executed a carefully orchestrated counterstrike designed to dismantle their scheme from multiple angles simultaneously. Marcus coordinated the property security team from a makeshift command station near the windows of the suite, his voice calm but authoritative as he directed the operation at Willow Creek Lane. Confirm no occupants before proceeding, he instructed the team leader via encrypted communication. Full documentation protocol: every room, every surface, catalog everything remaining and note anything missing from Mrs. Montgomery's inventory. On us. The main display, we watched through the security feeds as 3 unmarked vehicles pulled up to my home. The team, dressed in standard property inspection uniforms but moving with the disciplined efficiency of former military personnel, performed a thorough exterior sweep before carefully entering with the property access codes Marcus had provided. Property. Vacant, came the confirmation moments later. Proceeding with security update and inventory assessment. Locks? I asked, having been helped back to a seated position after my brief rest. Changing now, Marcus confirmed. Biometric access is being recoded to remove Mr. Montgomery's credentials. Digital security systems are being transferred to Archer's protected server. Simultaneously, Mira executed the legal component of our response, her fingers moving rapidly, across her tablet as she finalized the emergency filings she'd prepared. Injunction granted, she announced, holding up her screen to show Judge Harriman's electronic signature. All assets connected to the property transaction are officially frozen pending investigation of potential fraud. The court has also approved emergency orders for the 3 storage facilities based on your inventory documentation. Timing? I asked. Sheriff's deputies will execute the orders at the storage facilities at 8 a.m., Mira replied. Standard procedure for non-residential locations. Devin, still surrounded by his array of financial dashboards, worked the most technical aspect of our counteroffensive. His focus remained unbroken as his fingers flew across multiple keyboards, triggering financial safeguards and tracking protocols throughout Richard's carefully constructed network. First Caribbean Bank has flagged the accounts, he reported, without looking up. Their compliance department has implemented a 72-hour hold based on the court order and suspicious pattern alerts. The Nevada entity's accounts are similarly restricted. What about the accounts we don't know about yet? I pressed, aware that Richard's planning likely included contingencies. That's where it gets interesting, Devin replied, pushing his glasses up with one finger. Your husband created a traceable pattern across all his known accounts. Consistent transfer timing, similar amount structures, recurring IP addresses for access. I've established trace algorithms that will flag any account showing matching behavioral patterns. Like financial fingerprinting, Eliza observed. Precisely, Devin confirmed. If he attempts to access or transfer funds from previously unidentified accounts using his established patterns, the system will detect and flag those transactions. On my personal laptop, I monitored a different aspect of the response, Richard's increasingly frantic communication attempts. His text messages progressed from concerned to demanding to openly threatening as the night wore on. 17 p.m. Vanessa, we need to talk about this misunderstanding right now. 10:04 p.m. I'm trying to be patient given your medical condition, but your silence is unacceptable. 10:38 p.m. Whatever you think you know is wrong. Call me immediately. 11:15 p.m. My attorney will be contacting you tomorrow if I don't hear from you tonight. 11:42 p.m. You're making a serious mistake. This can still be resolved if you stop. Whatever you're doing. The most recent message had arrived just minutes ago. My cards aren't working. What have you done? I allowed myself a small smile at that last message. Richard was discovering the first tangible consequences of his actions, the financial walls closing in around his escape plan. His confusion would soon transform into understanding as each element of his scheme systematically collapsed. Mrs. Montgomery, called one of the security team members from the video feed at Willow Creek. We've discovered something concerning in the master bedroom closet. The camera panned to show a hidden compartment revealed behind a false panel in what had been Richard's wardrobe, a space I'd never known existed despite living in the house for years. Inside sat a small safe, professionally installed and concealed. Can you open it? I asked. It's a biometric model, the team leader replied. Requires Mr. Montgomery's fingerprint. Mira immediately began drafting another document. I'll request an emergency order for forensic access, but it will take until morning at the earliest. We don't need to wait, I said, turning to Devin. What information do we already have about accounts or assets we haven't yet secured? The forensic accountant consulted his notes. Based on the transaction patterns, I've identified 2 additional likely storage locations we haven't confirmed yet. There's also evidence of a secondary property purchase in Miami, not in Richard's name, but following his typical layered ownership structure. Miami, I repeated, recalling Brielle's comment about meeting there. That would align with their accelerated departure plan. The property was purchased 3 months ago through Coastal Horizon LLC, Devin continued, displaying the documentation. A shell company with connections to the same Nevada investment group that's been collecting your art and valuables. So they've been preparing a destination while systematically emptying our home, I summarized, the calculated nature of the betrayal still staggering despite everything we'd uncovered. Eliza, who had been relatively quiet while coordinating the team's various efforts, suddenly straightened at her station. Vanessa, take a look at this. She enlarged a section of the security footage showing the team's inventory work in my home office. The camera focused on an open drawer containing what appeared to be financial documents. Can we get a closer look at those papers? I requested. The team member obliged, carefully removing and displaying the contents. A series of life insurance policy documents, mine and Richard's. I'd been aware of our standard policies, but these were amendments I'd never seen, dated just 6 weeks earlier. He increased my coverage, I realized aloud, the implications washing over me in a cold wave, by $3 million, with himself as sole beneficiary, and removed the exclusion clauses, Mira noted grimly, examining the zoomed-in documentation. The original policy had standard exclusions for certain high-risk scenarios. The timing aligned with an unsettling clarity. Just before my increasingly severe back pain had culminated in emergency surgery. The surgery Richard had been so insistent should be performed immediately, overriding my preference to get a second opinion. Devin, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I need you to investigate all of Richard's communications with my doctors and the insurance company over the past 2 months. You think he... Eliza began, then stopped, unwilling to vocalize, the suspicion taking shape. I don't know what to think anymore, I replied honestly, but the coincidence of timing between my medical emergency and his exit strategy seems less coincidental by the hour. Helen, who had been monitoring my vital signs throughout this revelation, spoke up with professional concern. Mrs. Montgomery, your blood pressure is elevating significantly. I recommend a short break and perhaps a mild sedative." "No sedatives," I responded firmly. "I need absolute clarity tonight." "Then at least a brief rest and hydration," she insisted. "Your recovery is still the physiological priority, regardless of these circumstances." I reluctantly agreed, allowing Helen to adjust my position and provide the prescribed pain medication, though I opted for the minimum effective dose to maintain mental sharpness. As the team continued executing our response plan, I found myself reflecting on the photograph Richard had packed in his hasty departure, the one from our Santorini trip 3 years ago. In the image, we stood against the backdrop of the brilliant blue Aegean, his arm around my waist, both of us smiling into the camera. I'd thought then that his expression reflected the same contentment I felt. Now I wondered if he'd already been calculating even then how much my assets would be worth to him. The security team leader's voice cut through my thoughts. "Mrs. Montgomery, we've completed the initial security protocols. The property is secured, access credentials updated, and preliminary inventory completed. What are your instructions regarding items Mr. Montgomery clearly intended to remove next?" On screen, he indicated several designer suitcases packed but left behind in Richard's hasty departure, presumably containing more valuables he'd planned to take during their accelerated exit. "Document everything," I instructed. "Then secure those items separately for forensic analysis." As Devon continued locking down accounts and Mira prepared additional legal actions, I turned to Marcus with a question that had been forming throughout our tactical response. "The house, my house," I clarified. "What exactly is its status now?" Marcus consulted the property acquisition documents. "Legally, Archer Investments owns it through Kairos Properties. The transaction was completed with all proper documentation, despite the forged signature. Unwinding that transaction would require separate legal action." "I don't want to unwind it," I said, the beginnings of a longer-term strategy taking shape. "I want to keep it exactly as it is. My house, owned by my company, with Richard believing he successfully sold it out from under me." Mira looked up with professional interest. "You're setting up a strategic revelation for the confrontation?" "Precisely," I confirmed. "When is Spencer Lawrence's office open tomorrow?" 9 a.m., Eliza supplied after a quick search. "Schedule a video conference for 9:15, I instructed. I think it's time Richard's attorney understood exactly who he's been helping defraud and what that means for his own professional future, the C. Confrontation unfolded with precise dramatic timing the following morning, orchestrated with the same strategic patience that had built my investment portfolio. I sat propped against pillows in the Four Seasons suite, dressed not in hospital attire, but in a silk blouse and tailored jacket, professional armor carefully selected by Eliza and arranged by Helen to accommodate my surgical restrictions. The effect was calculated, a woman in control despite circumstances that might have devastated someone less prepared. Spencer Lawrence's face appeared on the main screen at exactly 9:15 a.m., his expression transitioning from polite professional interest to poorly concealed alarm when he recognized me. Behind his carefully groomed exterior, sandy hair precisely, styled light blue tie perfectly knotted, I detected the first flickers of comprehension about the precarious position in which he now found himself. "Mrs. Montgomery," he began, recovering quickly. "This is unexpected. I was under the impression you were hospitalized." "I was," I replied calmly, "for emergency spinal surgery, during which time you facilitated the sale of my home through falsified documentation." Spencer's practiced composure wavered slightly. His eyes darted briefly off camera, likely toward his office door as he calculated whether this conversation required immediate legal representation of his own. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion," he attempted, lawyer instincts kicking in. "I simply represented Mr. Montgomery in a standard property transaction. All documentation appeared to be in order, with proper signatures from both parties." Mira stepped into frame beside me, her presence deliberately intimidating. "Mr. Lawrence, I'm Meera Patel, Mrs. Montgomery's legal counsel. We've secured court orders freezing all assets connected to the transaction you facilitated based on evidence of signature forgery, fraudulent representation, and attempted theft of marital assets during a medical emergency. The color drained from Spencer's face as Meera continued, her tone devastatingly matter-of-fact. As you're undoubtedly aware, knowingly participating in such activities constitutes several violations of the Illinois Rules of Professional Conduct, specifically Rules 1.2, 4.1, and 8.4. The disciplinary consequences typically include suspension or disbarment. I had no knowledge of any forgery, Spencer insisted, his previously smooth demeanor cracking. Richard assured me Mrs. Montgomery had signed the documentation prior to her hospitalization. My hospitalization was emergency in nature, Mr. Lawrence, I interrupted. Unplanned and sudden, which makes your claim about pre-signed documents not only false, but demonstrably impossible. Marcus joined us on camera, tablet in hand. Additionally, our records indicate you personally notarized the allegedly pre-signed documents on June 10th, 2 days after Mrs. Montgomery's emergency admission to Northwestern Memorial when she was in post-surgical recovery and heavily sedated. Spencer swallowed visibly, legal training battling with self-preservation. I may have notarized documents presented to me by Mr. Montgomery without witnessing the original signature, a technical oversight that constitutes notary fraud, Meera finished for him. A Class A misdemeanor in Illinois that can result in removal of your notary commission and, when combined with the ethical violations already noted, creates significant jeopardy for your legal career. The attorney's facade crumbled completely. Mrs. Montgomery, I had no idea Richard was acting without your knowledge or consent. He presented this as a jointly agreed-upon transaction. Did you attempt to contact me directly at any point to confirm my participation in selling my primary residence? I asked, already knowing the answer. Richard said you were unavailable due to health concerns, Spencer admitted, looking increasingly uncomfortable. He provided the documentation with what appeared to be your signature. And you, a professional attorney with 15 years of experience in real estate transactions, never thought to question why a wife was unreachable during the sale of her primary marital residence. Meera pressed, her tone suggesting his competence was in question along with his ethics. Richard and I have been friends since college, Spencer said weakly, as if personal history justified professional negligence. A friendship that may cost you your license to practice law, I observed calmly. Unless you're prepared to make different choices now than you did when facilitating fraud against an incapacitated woman. Spencer straightened slightly, sensing a potential path to redemption. What exactly are you proposing? Complete transparency, I replied. Everything you know about Richard's plans, the offshore accounts, the property in Miami, the storage facilities containing my personal property, and any other aspects of this scheme you facilitated or were aware of. And in exchange, he asked cautiously, we focus our legal complaints on Richard rather than extending them to all parties who enabled his actions, Meera explained. Though I should note this doesn't guarantee immunity from bar association investigations or potential criminal charges. It merely represents Mrs. Montgomery's willingness not to actively pursue those avenues if your cooperation is immediate and complete. Spencer didn't hesitate. Richard contacted me 3 months ago about establishing a confidential exit strategy. Initially, he framed it as estate planning and asset protection, but the timeline accelerated dramatically after your medical diagnosis. Continue, I encouraged when he paused. The Miami property was purchased through Coastal Horizon LLC 6 weeks ago, a waterfront condominium on Brickell Avenue held in a layered ownership structure. Richard established the shell company with Brielle Parker as the nominal managing director, though he maintains beneficial ownership through a series of operating agreements. The property transaction was meant to be the final step before departure, Spencer continued, visibly relieved to unburden himself despite the professional consequences. The proceeds were directed to First Caribbean Bank, scheduled for transfer to a more permanent structure on Friday, tomorrow. And the storage facilities? Marcus prompted. 3 primary locations, Spencer confirmed. 1 in Schaumburg, 1 in Naperville, and 1 in Indiana just across the state line. Richard selected the jurisdictional spread deliberately to complicate potential recovery efforts. I nodded to Eliza, who made notes while maintaining the recording of Spencer's voluntary disclosure. His professional instincts had apparently surrendered to self-preservation, each revelation potentially mitigating the severity of consequences he would face. Was Richard planning to divorce me or simply disappear? I asked, the question more personal than strategic. Spencer hesitated, uncomfortable with the human dimension of the fraud he'd facilitated. The plan involved an extended absence explained by a consulting opportunity abroad. Once established in Miami, he intended to file for divorce citing irreconcilable differences and abandonment, with you receiving notice at your business address after the statutory waiting period. The calculated cruelty of the plan, abandoning me during medical recovery, stealing my assets, then claiming abandonment as grounds for divorce, momentarily pierced the professional composure I'd maintained. Helen noticed immediately, moving closer to monitor my vital signs with quiet concern. "One final question, Mr. Lawrence," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional impact. "Did Richard mention anything about my life insurance policy?" Spencer's expression shifted to genuine confusion. "Life insurance? No, nothing specific. He mentioned reviewing your combined insurance portfolio as part of the estate planning cover story, but no details about life insurance specifically." Exchanged glances with Mira, uncertain whether Spencer's apparent ignorance was genuine or self-protective. Before we could press further, his attention was diverted by something off camera, a notification or message that caused visible alarm. "I need to go," he said abruptly. "Richard is trying to reach me urgently." "Of course," I replied smoothly. "I imagine his financial cards have stopped functioning, and the property security system no longer recognizes his biometrics. He must be quite concerned." Understanding dawned on Spencer's face. "You've already frozen everything." "The court orders were executed at midnight," Mira confirmed. "All connected accounts and assets are currently inaccessible pending investigation." "One more thing before you speak with Richard," I added, delivering the strategic revelation I'd planned since discovering the initial betrayal. "You might be interested to know who purchased my house." Spencer frowned, clearly confused by the apparent non sequitur. "Kairos Properties, a standard corporate acquisition entity." "Kairos Properties is a wholly owned subsidiary of Archer Investments," Marcus explained, allowing himself a small smile. "Mrs. Montgomery's company." Spencer's expression would have been comical under different circumstances, shock giving way to comprehension and finally to a grim appreciation of the symmetry. "Richard sold your house to you?" he asked, processing the implications. Without realizing it, I confirmed. My company's automated acquisition system identified the property as significantly undervalued and flagged it for purchase. Richard essentially stole from me to sell to me, with you facilitating the entire circular transaction. The attorney shook his head in disbelief. He never bothered to research the buyer. "Richard always underestimated my business acumen," I replied. "A mistake that has proven considerably more expensive than he anticipated." "I'll provide complete documentation of everything I know," Spencer promised, the reality of his situation fully dawning. "Richard's going to be furious when he discovers what's happened. When you speak with him," I suggested, "you might mention that I'm still considering whether to pursue criminal charges for fraud, theft, and potentially more serious matters related to my medical situation." "More serious matters?" Spencer repeated, his legal mind grasping the implication immediately. "The timing of my emergency surgery and his exit strategy seems remarkably convenient," I noted. as does the recent modification to my life insurance policy. Spencer's expression confirmed that this aspect of Richard's planning had indeed been concealed from him. I had no knowledge of. Your continued cooperation will help clarify your level of involvement, Mira interrupted smoothly. We'll expect those documents within the hour. After Spencer disconnected, promising immediate compliance, I allowed myself to lean back against the pillows, the exertion of the confrontation taking its toll on my recovering body. Helen immediately adjusted my position and checked my pain levels, her professional concern evident. Your blood pressure remained elevated throughout that exchange, she noted. While impressive, these confrontations tax your recovery resources significantly. A necessary expenditure, I replied, accepting the medication she offered. Richard needs to understand that his actions have consequences, and those consequences are being orchestrated by the woman he believed too weakened to notice his betrayal. Mira's phone chimed with an incoming message. Judge Harriman has extended the emergency orders based on Spencer's initial admission. The Sheriff's Department is executing search warrants at all 3 storage facilities now, and a freeze order has been placed on the Miami property. Richard's just called 3 times in succession, Eliza reported, monitoring my phone. Voicemail notifications indicate increased agitation. The last message suggests he's planning to come to the hospital to sort this out immediately. Let him, I replied, a plan forming. In fact, Eliza, please call him back from my phone. Tell him I've been discharged and am recuperating at Northwestern Memorial's Executive Recovery Suite. Suggest he comes immediately if he wants to resolve this situation. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Directing him to a location where you aren't? Precisely, I confirmed. While Richard wastes time searching for me at Northwestern, we'll be executing the next phase of our response. Devin, what's the status of the financial containment? The forensic accountant looked up from his workstation with professional satisfaction. Complete lockdown achieved. His attempt to access emergency funds through a previously unidentified account at United Bank triggered our pattern recognition protocols. That account has now been frozen as well. Effectively, Mr. Montgomery is financially stranded. And Brielle Parker? I asked. Currently checking into the Four Seasons Miami, Eliza reported, looking up from her tablet with a hint of irony. Apparently, using her personal credit card, as their joint travel account has been frozen. Perfect, I said, turning to Mira. Contact your white-collar crime division connection. I think it's time for Ms. Parker to receive some official visitors regarding her role in real estate fraud and conspiracy to commit theft. As my team mobilized this next wave of consequences, I found myself reflecting on the photograph from Santorini again, the carefree image of a marriage that had apparently been a calculation from the beginning. The revelation should have devastated me, yet instead, I felt an unexpected clarity. Richard had attempted to exploit what he perceived as my greatest vulnerability, never realizing he was attacking my greatest strength. The strategic mind that had built Archer Investments and could just as effectively dismantle his scheme. Eliza, I said, making a decision. Please contact Dr. Patel. I'd like to schedule a comprehensive review of all my medical records and treatment decisions over the past month, with particular attention to the necessity and timing of my surgery. The implications of my request hung in the air, acknowledged but unspoken by my team. If Richard's betrayal extended beyond financial deception into medical manipulation, the consequences would move from civil recovery to criminal prosecution. When you speak with him, I suggested, you might mention that I'm still considering whether to pursue criminal charges for fraud, theft, and potentially more serious matters related to my medical situation. More serious matters? Spencer repeated, his legal mind grasping the implication immediately. The timing of my emergency surgery and his exit strategy seems remarkably convenient, I noted, as does the recent modification to my life insurance policy. Spencer's expression confirmed that this aspect of Richard's planning had indeed been concealed from him. I had no knowledge of. Your continued cooperation will help clarify your level of involvement, Mira interrupted smoothly. We'll expect Those documents within the hour. After Spencer disconnected, promising immediate compliance, I allowed myself to lean back against the pillows, the exertion of the confrontation taking its toll on my recovering body. Helen immediately adjusted my position and checked my pain levels, her professional concern evident. "Your blood pressure remained elevated throughout that exchange," she noted. "While impressive, these confrontations tax your recovery resources significantly." "A necessary expenditure," I replied, accepting the medication she offered. "Richard needs to understand that his actions have consequences, and those consequences are being orchestrated by the woman he believed too weakened to notice his betrayal." Mira's phone chimed with an incoming message. "Judge Harriman has extended the emergency orders based on Spencer's initial admission. The Sheriff's Department is executing search warrants at all 3 storage facilities now, and a freeze order has been placed on the Miami property." "Richard's just called 3 times in succession," Eliza reported, monitoring my phone. "Voicemail notifications indicate increased agitation. The last message suggests he's planning to come to the hospital to sort this out immediately." "Let him," I replied, a plan forming. "In fact, Eliza, please call him back from my phone. Tell him I've been discharged and am recuperating at Northwestern Memorial's Executive Recovery Suite. Suggest he comes immediately if he wants to resolve this situation." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Directing him to a location where you aren't?" "Precisely," I confirmed. "While Richard wastes time searching for me at Northwestern, we'll be executing the next phase of our response. Devin, what's the status of the financial containment?" The forensic accountant looked up from his workstation with professional satisfaction. "Complete lockdown achieved. His attempt to access emergency funds through a previously unidentified account at United Bank triggered our pattern recognition protocols. That account has now been frozen as well. Effectively, Mr. Montgomery is financially stranded." "And Brielle Parker?" I asked. "Currently checking into the Four Seasons Miami," Eliza reported, looking up from her tablet with a hint of irony. "Apparently, using her personal credit card, as their joint travel account has been frozen." "Perfect," I said, turning to Mira. "Contact your white-collar crime division connection. I think it's time for Ms. Parker to receive some official visitors regarding her role in real estate fraud and conspiracy to commit theft." As my team mobilized this next wave of consequences, I found myself reflecting on the photograph from Santorini again, the carefree image of a marriage that had apparently been a calculation from the beginning. The revelation should have devastated me, yet instead, I felt an unexpected clarity. Richard had attempted to exploit what he perceived as my greatest vulnerability, never realizing he was attacking my greatest strength. The strategic mind that had built Archer Investments and could just as effectively dismantle his scheme. "Eliza," I said, making a decision. "Please contact Dr. Patel. I'd like to schedule a comprehensive review of all my medical records and treatment decisions over the past month, with particular attention to the necessity and timing of my surgery." The implications of my request hung in the air, acknowledged but unspoken by my team. If Richard's betrayal extended beyond financial deception into medical manipulation, the consequences would move from civil recovery to criminal prosecution. "And one more thing," I added, my resolve hardening. "Schedule a meeting with our security team for this afternoon. It's time to discuss recovering my grandmother's watch collection from the storage facility in Indiana. I believe I'm well enough for a short field trip tomorrow." The unraveling accelerated with unexpected momentum throughout the afternoon, layers of Richard's deception peeling away to reveal a betrayal more calculated than I had initially believed possible. From my command center in the Four Seasons suite, I orchestrated and witnessed the systematic dismantling of his carefully constructed escape plan, each revelation adding new dimensions to his duplicity. At 1:47 p.m., Eliza received confirmation that the Sheriff's Department had successfully executed search warrants at all 3 storage facilities. The inventory reports flowed in via secure channel, accompanied by photographs documenting the scope of Richard's theft. "The Schaumburg facility contains most of your art collection," Eliza reported, displaying images on the main screen. 17 pieces total, including the Rothko lithograph from your father's collection and the series of emerging artist works you acquired last year. The photographs showed my carefully curated collection, wrapped in protective materials and arranged with museum-quality precision, a jarring contrast to the industrial storage unit that housed them. Each piece represented not just financial value, but personal connection. Artists I had supported early in their careers, works that commemorated significant milestones, pieces selected with my father before his passing. The Naperville location appears to contain primarily jewelry and collectibles, Eliza continued, switching to the second facility's inventory. Your grandmother's watch collection, the anniversary jewelry, and... She paused, highlighting a particular image. The family silver that Richard claimed was damaged beyond repair during the move into Willow Creek. I stared at the photograph of the antique silverware set my father had preserved through financial hardship, telling me once that some legacies aren't measured in dollars. Richard had staged an elaborate accident involving a collapsed shelf, presenting me with bent and twisted pieces as evidence while apparently storing the undamaged originals for his future benefit. And Indiana? I asked, bracing myself for what else might have been hidden across state lines. That's where it gets interesting, Mira interjected, reviewing the inventory documentation from her tablet. The Indiana facility contains financial and legal documents rather than valuables. Some appear to be original property deeds, investment, certificates, and, most concerning, medical records. My medical records? I clarified, the implication sending a chill through me despite the suite's careful climate control. Appears so, Mira confirmed, enlarging an image that clearly showed file folders labeled with Northwestern Memorial Hospital's logo and my patient information. The Sheriff's Department has secured these as evidence, given their potentially sensitive nature. Devin looked up from his financial forensics work, his expression grave. This aligns with what I've uncovered in the electronic trail. Mr. Montgomery accessed your patient portal multiple times in the weeks leading up to your surgery, downloading records and correspondence with specialists. My mind raced through the implications, remembering how Richard had insisted on attending my medical appointments, positioning himself as the supportive husband, while apparently gathering information for purposes I was only beginning to comprehend. Doctor. Patel is on her way, Eliza reported, returning from a phone consultation in the adjoining room. She's bringing your complete medical file and has requested permission to bring a colleague, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, a specialist in spinal procedures who recently joined Northwestern's surgical team. I nodded agreement, turning to Helen, who had been quietly monitoring my condition throughout the afternoon. What's your medical assessment of my current recovery status? You're progressing remarkably well for someone 8 days post-spinal surgery, she replied with professional candor. Better than the standard recovery trajectory, though still requiring significant caution regarding movement and exertion. Enough to participate in a supervised recovery of my personal items tomorrow? I pressed, already formulating the next phase of my response. Helen considered this with clinical detachment. A brief controlled excursion with proper transport and support would be medically acceptable, provided you maintain position restrictions and use the prescribed mobility aids. Before I could respond, Eliza's tablet chimed with a high-priority notification. Richard has just arrived at Northwestern Memorial, she reported, accessing the hospital's security feed that Anita had arranged for our monitoring. He appears to be insisting on information about your location. The footage showed Richard at the executive floor nurses' station, his normally polished appearance noticeably disheveled. His gestures conveyed increasing agitation as the staff repeatedly denied having any information about my presence. He's playing his final cards, I observed, watching his performance of husbandly concern. When manipulation fails, he'll attempt intimidation. As if confirming my assessment, Richard's body language shifted on screen. He leaned forward aggressively, one finger jabbing toward the charge nurse as security personnel began moving in. His direction. Hospital security is escorting him from the premises, Eliza narrated, Northwestern's administrator has been advised of the situation and has authorized a formal trespass warning if he returns. My phone lit up with Richard's incoming call, his 7th attempt in the past hour. This time, I nodded to Mira, who activated the recording equipment before I answered on speaker. "Vanessa, this has gone far enough." Richard's voice vibrated with barely controlled fury. "Whatever you think you're doing, you need to stop immediately. You're confused because of the medication." "I'm actually quite clear-headed," I interrupted, calmly. "Clear enough to understand exactly what you've been planning for the past year." "This is ridiculous," he blustered. "I've been planning our future, making necessary arrangements while you focused on your recovery. Arrangements that included selling my house, emptying our accounts, and storing my possessions in 3 different states," I finished for him. "Curious definition of our future, considering you purchased a single-occupancy condominium in Miami under a shell company." The momentary silence conveyed his shock at the precision of my knowledge. "You've been speaking to Spencer," he finally said, his tone shifting to something colder, more calculated. "He's misrepresented the situation entirely. These were temporary measures. Spencer provided complete documentation of your plans this morning," I countered, "including the offshore account structure, the property arrangements with Brielle Parker, and your intention to file for abandonment after establishing residence in Florida. You don't understand the financial pressures we've been facing," Richard attempted, switching tactics. "Archer's expansion has tied up our liquidity, and with your medical expenses, my company maintains comprehensive executive medical coverage," I reminded him. "And our household accounts contained more than adequate reserves. Try again, Richard." His facade cracked further. "Where are you? We need to discuss this in person, not over the phone like strangers." "We became strangers the moment you decided to steal from me while I recovered from surgery," I replied evenly. "Speaking of which, I'm reviewing the medical necessity and timing of that procedure with independent specialists this afternoon. Fascinating coincidence how my health crisis aligned perfectly with your exit timeline." The sharp intake of breath, on the other end, confirmed my suspicion that this aspect of his scheme touched on something particularly damning. "That's an outrageous accusation," he managed, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've only ever wanted what's best for your health." "And for the $3 million in increased life insurance coverage you arranged 6 weeks ago?" I asked. "The policy amendments with the eliminated exclusion clauses?" Another telling silence. "Vanessa, you're creating conspiracy theories out of standard financial planning," he finally said, attempting to reclaim the narrative. "This is exactly why I've been handling these matters. Your focus on Archer has made you paranoid about normal administrative decisions." "Let's discuss normal administrative decisions," I countered. "Does that category include forging my signature on property documents, or establishing shell companies to hide marital assets, or perhaps programming the house security system to record selectively when you and Brielle were having particularly productive real estate consultations in our bedroom?" The mention of recordings visibly rattled him, judging by his audible gasp. "You're bluffing. There's no—" "We have everything." "Richard," I interrupted, my patience with his denials waning. "The offshore accounts are frozen. The storage facilities are being inventoried by the sheriff's department as we speak. Brielle is about to receive visitors from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division at her Miami hotel. The house security codes have been changed and your access revoked." "You can't do this," he insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "Half of everything is legally mine." "Interesting you should mention legal standing," Mira interjected smoothly. "Attempted theft of marital assets during a spouse's medical incapacitation creates specific vulnerabilities under Illinois family law. Add documented fraud and potential insurance manipulation, and your position becomes remarkably precarious." "Who is that?" Richard demanded. "Am I on speaker? Vanessa, who else is there?" "My legal counsel, my medical team, and representatives from Archer Investments," I replied. all working to untangle and document your scheme while you waste time at Northwestern Memorial looking for me. This is a private matter between husband and wife, he insisted. You've involved all these people in what should be a confidential... You involved Brielle, Spencer, storage facility managers in 3 states, offshore bankers, and who knows how many others in your plot to abandon and defraud me, I countered. You surrendered any claim to privacy when you turned our marriage into a criminal conspiracy. The arrival of Dr. Patel and her colleague momentarily diverted my attention from Richard's increasingly desperate protestations. Anita entered with professional purpose, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man carrying a substantial medical file and imaging portfolio. Richard, I said, returning to the call, I need to conclude this conversation. My medical consultants have arrived to review the necessity and timing of my surgical procedure. Vanessa, wait, he began, panic evident in his voice. One last thing, I added before ending the call. You might be interested to know who purchased Willow Creek Lane, the corporate entity you sold my house to? It's a subsidiary of Archer Investments. You quite literally sold my house to my own company. I disconnected before he could respond, handing the phone to Eliza, who would ensure the conversation was properly archived for potential legal proceedings. Dr. Gupta, Anita introduced her colleague, is one of the country's leading experts in minimally invasive spinal procedures. He's reviewed your case at my request. The neurosurgeon nodded respectfully. Mrs. Montgomery, I've examined your complete medical history, imaging studies, and surgical records. I've also reviewed the consultation notes from Dr. Lowell, who performed your procedure and your assessment, I prompted, noting his carefully neutral expression. Your condition did ultimately require surgical intervention, he acknowledged. However, the emergency nature and specific approach selected raised several questions regarding standard of care and treatment progression. Meaning? I pressed. Conservative treatment options were prematurely abandoned, he explained, opening the imaging portfolio to display my spinal MRIs with precise chronological labeling. Based on these images taken 3 days apart, your condition, while serious, showed no indicators requiring immediate surgical intervention at the time Dr. Lowell recommended emergency procedures. Anita continued the explanation. Standard protocol for your presentation would typically involve continued conservative management, medication, physical therapy, possibly targeted injections, with surgery reserved if those approaches failed after 4 to 6 weeks. Yet Dr. Lowell advocated immediate surgical intervention, Dr. Gupta noted, citing potential nerve damage risks that, while theoretically possible, were not supported by the clinical evidence available at that time. The implications settled heavily in the room as he continued. Additionally, the surgical approach selected was unnecessarily invasive compared to current best practices for your specific condition, resulting in a longer recovery period, I concluded, the pieces aligning with disturbing clarity. Significantly longer, Anita confirmed grimly. A minimally invasive approach would typically allow return to normal activities within 2 to 3 weeks. The procedure performed extends that timeline to 6 to 8 weeks minimum. And who recommended Dr. Lowell? Mira asked, though I suspected we all knew. The answer. Richard insisted, I recalled, the memory crystallizing. He said Lowell came highly recommended by associates whose opinions he trusted. Devin looked up from his financial analysis. Dr. Lowell appears in Mr. Montgomery's phone records and emails beginning approximately 4 months ago. They met socially at the Lakeside Country Club, according to calendar entries I've recovered from the cloud backup of your husband's devices. The orchestrated nature of my medical crisis came into sharper focus, not manufactured entirely, but opportunistically, manipulated by Richard to serve his exit strategy. A genuine medical condition guided toward the most restrictive treatment approach, ensuring maximum incapacitation during his planned disappearance with my assets. I'd like to document all of this formally, I said to Dr. Gupta. Would you be willing to provide an expert opinion regarding the medical decisions made in my case? Already prepared, he replied, producing a sealed envelope. My preliminary findings regarding the concerning aspects of your case, with the caveat that while the decisions deviated from best practices, definitively proving malicious intent would require additional investigation. As the doctors continued reviewing my medical history, Eliza approached with a tablet displaying a breaking news headline. Prominent realtor arrested in Miami for alleged role in real estate fraud scheme. The accompanying photograph showed Brielle Parker being escorted from the Four Seasons Miami by federal agents. It's happening faster than anticipated, Mira observed, reading the article. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division moved quickly once they connected this case to existing investigations of similar fraud patterns. Richard will see this soon, I noted. His desperation level is about to increase significantly. As if summoned, by my observation, my phone lit up with another incoming call. Not from Richard this time, but from an unknown number. I nodded to Mira, who reactivated the recording equipment before I answered on speaker. Mrs. Montgomery? The unfamiliar female voice was professionally crisp. This is Special Agent Sarah Dawson with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I understand you've been working with local authorities regarding a potential fraud case involving your husband, Richard Montgomery, and several associates. That's correct, I confirmed, exchanging glances with my team. We've been investigating a pattern of similar cases across several states, Agent Dawson continued. Ms. Parker's apprehension has yielded significant information that may be relevant to your situation. Would you be available to meet with our team tomorrow morning? I would, I replied, the pieces of Richard's scheme expanding beyond even my suspicions. Though due to recent surgery, I'd prefer to meet here at my current location. Understood. We'll come to you at 10 a.m., she agreed. I should mention that we've issued a material witness detention order for Richard Montgomery. If you have any contact with him, please notify us immediately. As the call ended, I turned to my assembled team, the full scope of Richard's unraveling now accelerating beyond my orchestration into the realm of federal investigation. What had begun as my tactical response to personal betrayal had evidently intersected with a larger pattern of systematic fraud that had already been under federal scrutiny. It seems, I observed with grim satisfaction, that Richard's betrayal was neither as unique nor as clever as he believed. The tables turned completely at precisely 8:27 a.m. the following morning, when my secure phone rang with a call from an unexpected source, the security team at 1428 Willow Creek Lane. I had just completed my morning physical therapy session with Helen, the carefully controlled movements designed to maintain muscle tone without compromising my surgical recovery. Despite the exertion, I answered immediately. My tactical instincts recognizing the timing was significant. Mrs. Montgomery, the team leader reported, his professional tone tinged with urgency. Richard Montgomery attempted unauthorized entry to the property approximately 10 minutes ago. When biometric access failed, he became confrontational, eventually attempting to force entry through the garden door. Is he still on the premises? I asked, already signaling to Eliza to activate our contingency protocols. Yes, ma'am. We've detained him in the security office pending your instructions. He's demanding to speak with you directly. I exchanged glances with Mira, who had been preparing documentation for our meeting with the FBI later that morning. Her slight nod confirmed what I'd already decided. The confrontation I'd been strategically orchestrating had arrived, though not entirely on my terms. Keep him there, I instructed. We're en route, and notify Agent Dawson that her material witness has been located. The next 45 minutes unfolded with military precision. Helen efficiently prepared me for transport, ensuring my surgical site remained properly supported, while Eliza coordinated with the medical transport service. We'd arranged as a contingency. Mira gathered the essential legal documentation we'd need, while Devin secured digital backups of all financial evidence. By 9:15 a.m., our convoy departed the Four Seasons, my medical transport vehicle flanked by 2 security SUVs containing my team, and our accumulated evidence. The journey to Willow Creek Lane passed in strategic silence, each of us mentally preparing for the confrontation ahead. I used the time to center myself, acknowledging the complex emotions beneath my calculated exterior. The betrayal that still cut deep despite my tactical response. The lingering disbelief that 9 years of marriage had culminated in such calculated deception. As we approached the familiar ivy-covered Tudor facade of my home, I felt a surge of protective determination. This house represented more than property. It embodied the promise I'd made to my father, the legacy I'd built through persistence and strategic vision. Richard had attempted to steal not just an asset, but the physical manifestation of my resilience. "Are you certain you're ready for this?" Helen asked quietly as the medical transport navigated the circular driveway. Confrontation of this nature creates significant physiological stress, which can impact surgical recovery. Some wounds require confronting their source to heal properly, I replied, my gaze fixed on the grand entrance where my security team awaited. This is as much a part of my recovery as any physical therapy. The security team had transformed the formal dining room into an impromptu conference area, with Richard detained in the adjacent study, my study, with my father's chess set still displayed on the antique side table where we'd played our final game before his illness accelerated. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Richard remained physically present in my space but contained, his freedom to maneuver greatly diminished. I was transferred to a specially designed mobility chair that maintained proper spinal alignment while allowing me to project authority, a crucial psychological element for what would follow. Mira positioned herself at my right hand, tablet ready with our legal documentation, while Eliza stood slightly behind, coordinating with both our security team and the FBI agents now en route. "Bring him in," I instructed once we were positioned. "And record everything." Richard entered with the practiced indignation of a man accustomed to controlling narratives. His normally impeccable appearance had deteriorated significantly. Designer, shirt wrinkled, stubble shadowing his jaw, eyes bloodshot from presumed sleeplessness. He faltered momentarily upon seeing me, clearly surprised by my composed presence and the assembled team surrounding me. "Vanessa," he began, attempting to reclaim familiar territory through the use of my name. "This has gone far enough. You've frozen our accounts, locked me out of my own home, and now I'm being treated like a criminal by rent-a-cops? This is absurd." "Mr. Montgomery," Mira interjected smoothly before I could respond, "please be advised that this conversation is being recorded and may be used in pending civil and criminal proceedings against you. Do you understand?" "I don't consent to being recorded in my own home," he snapped, grasping at procedural objections to avoid substantive conversation. "This property is legally owned by Kairos Properties, a subsidiary of Archer Investments," I reminded him calmly. "You relinquished any ownership claim when you sold it, fraudulently, 8 days ago. You're here only at my discretion and can be removed at any time." The reality of his situation visibly dawned on him as he glanced around the dining room, taking in not just my team but the subtle changes already implemented by the property security team. The replacement of locks, the upgraded security panels, the strategic rearrangement of furniture to accommodate surveillance equipment. "This is still legally my residence under the occupancy agreement," he attempted, though his voice lacked conviction. "I negotiated 60 days. The occupancy agreement contains standard provisions regarding criminal activity on the premises," Marcus interjected, consulting the property documents. "Section 7.3 specifically nullifies occupancy rights if the occupant engages in illegal behavior, including but not limited to theft, fraud, or harassment." "What theft?" Richard demanded, his composure fracturing further. "Everything in this house is jointly owned." "Except it wasn't," I interrupted, nodding to Eliza, who displayed images from the storage facilities on the dining room's wall monitor. "My grandmother's watches. My father's first editions. The art collection I built piece by piece over the past decade. All items you systematically removed while telling me they were damaged or lost. Richard paled slightly as the photographic evidence of his theft appeared in high-resolution detail. Those items were being professionally restored. In self-storage units registered under shell companies connected to offshore accounts? Devon asked mildly, looking up from his financial documentation. With insurance policies listing you as sole beneficiary in case of damage or loss? This is a misunderstanding, Richard insisted, though his eyes darted between team members, calculating dwindling options. A temporary arrangement while we prepared for relocation. To separate destinations, I noted. You to a single occupancy condominium in Miami purchased through Coastal Horizon LLC. And me. Where exactly, Richard? What was the plan for me? While you disappeared with my inheritance, my art, my family heirlooms. His silence spoke volumes, confirming what we'd already pieced together. There had been no provision for my future in his carefully orchestrated exit strategy. Let me clarify our current situation, I continued, maintaining the calm authority that had built my company despite my internal turmoil. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division has issued a material witness order for you in connection with an ongoing investigation into real estate fraud. Brielle Parker was arrested yesterday in Miami and is cooperating with federal authorities. The offshore accounts have been frozen under court order. The storage facilities containing my property have been secured and inventoried by law enforcement. Each statement landed like a precise blow, dismantling whatever counter-narrative Richard might have been formulating. Additionally, I continued, we've initiated investigation into the medical decisions surrounding my surgery, including the relationship between you and Dr. Lowell and the curious timing of amendments to my life insurance policy. At the mention of the insurance policy, Richard's expression shifted from calculated defensiveness to something approaching fear. This reaction confirmed my suspicion that whatever he'd planned went beyond financial opportunism into something potentially more sinister. You've always been paranoid about business associates, he attempted, trying to reframe my legitimate investigation as irrational suspicion. Now you're creating conspiracy theories about medical care? I recommended Lowell because he's the best in his field. The best at recommending unnecessarily invasive procedures with extended recovery periods? I questioned. Dr. Gupta, the actual leading authority in spinal procedures, has provided a comprehensive review, noting significant deviations from standard care in my case. This is ridiculous, Richard blustered, though his confidence continued deteriorating. You needed surgery. The timing was unfortunate but necessary. The timing was remarkably convenient, I corrected, coinciding perfectly with your accelerated exit timeline, the Miami property acquisition, and the final transfers to offshore accounts. Before Richard could formulate another denial, Eliza received an alert on her tablet. FBI agents have arrived, she announced. Agent Dawson requests permission to enter. Richard's face drained of remaining color. You called the FBI? Vanessa, whatever you think I've done, involving federal authorities is an extreme overreaction. I didn't call them, I clarified. They contacted me yesterday as part of an existing investigation into a pattern of similar cases across multiple states. Apparently, your scheme with Brielle wasn't as unique or creative as you believed. The security team escorted Agent Dawson and 2 colleagues into the dining room, their crisp, dark suits and professionally neutral expressions providing stark contrast to Richard's increasingly disheveled state. Agent Dawson, a compact woman with penetrating eyes and precisely cut silver hair, assessed the situation with practiced efficiency. Richard Montgomery? She confirmed, approaching him directly. I'm Special Agent Sarah Dawson, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We've been trying to locate you for the past 18 hours. I haven't done anything wrong, Richard insisted automatically, though his body language, shoulders hunched, hands fidgeting, betrayed his awareness of precisely how much evidence had accumulated against him. We'll discuss the specifics at our field office, Agent Dawson replied, her tone making clear this wasn't a request. "We're particularly interested in your connection to Jason Hargrove and the network of real estate fraud operations he's coordinated over the past 3 years." The name struck me with unexpected force. Jason Hargrove, a business associate Richard had introduced at several social functions over the years, always described as a consultant with international clients. I'd found him vaguely off-putting, but had dismissed my instinctive dislike as professional territoriality. Now, watching Richard's reaction to the name, I realized Hargrove represented yet another layer to this betrayal I hadn't yet uncovered. "I barely know Hargrove," Richard attempted, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "We've met at social events, nothing more." Agent Dawson's slight smile suggested she had anticipated this denial. "According to Ms. Parker's initial statement, Hargrove recruited both of you to his wealth redistribution program approximately 14 months ago. She was quite specific about your involvement, including your role in identifying high-value targets with potential medical vulnerabilities. The implication hung in the air like poison gas, that I hadn't been merely a victim of opportunistic betrayal by my husband, but a designated target in a systematic fraud operation. That Richard's interest in me may have been calculated from the beginning, our entire relationship potentially a long con aimed at eventual asset seizure." "That's absurd," Richard protested, though his eyes wouldn't meet mine. "Vanessa and I have been married 9 years. Our relationship has nothing to do with Hargrove or anyone else. Yet you followed the same pattern documented in 6 other cases, across 3 states, Agent Dawson noted, consulting her notes. Marriage to a financially successful woman, gradual isolation from professional connections, systematic cataloging of assets, manufactured medical crisis, accelerated liquidation during recovery, followed by disappearance with fraudulently obtained assets." Each point in the pattern aligned perfectly with my experience, suggesting a level of calculated manipulation that made my surgical pain seem trivial by comparison. The possibility that our entire marriage had been predicated on eventual theft created a visceral hollowness that momentarily threatened my composed exterior. "Mrs. Montgomery," Agent Dawson turned to me with professional respect, "we'll need your statement at our field office when you're medically cleared to travel. In the meantime, we'll take Mr. Montgomery for questioning regarding his connection to the Hargrove network." As federal agents prepared to escort Richard from the premises, he made a final desperate appeal. "Vanessa, you can't let them do this. Whatever you think I've done, we can work through it privately. 9 years of marriage deserves at least that consideration." I studied him carefully. This man who had shared my bed, my home, my life for nearly a decade. Had there ever been genuine feeling beneath the calculation? Had any moment of our shared history been untainted by his eventual exit strategy? Chattoy. "Years of marriage deserved honesty," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotional undertow. "It deserved loyalty during medical crisis. It deserved respect for the legacy I built. You provided none of these, Richard." "So this is revenge?" he attempted, trying to reframe my legitimate self-protection as emotional retaliation. "No," I corrected him. "This is consequence. You attempted to steal everything I've built while I was at my most vulnerable. Now you face the results of that choice." As federal agents led Richard away, his formerly commanding presence diminished to something altogether smaller. I remained in the dining room of the house he'd tried to steal, surrounded by the team that had helped me reclaim not just my property, but my agency in the face of calculated betrayal. "Ms. Dawson," I called as the agent prepared to follow her colleagues. "When you questioned whether our entire marriage was part of this scheme, was that speculation, or do you have evidence suggesting Richard targeted me from the beginning?" The Zian FBI agent turned back, her expression softening slightly with what might have been professional compassion. "We've discovered recruitment materials in Hargrove's operation that include targeting guidelines for identifying potential marks. Successful self-made individuals with minimal family connections feature prominently in those guidelines." She hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Montgomery, your case differs from the others in one significant respect. The other victims didn't uncover the scheme independently or mobilize such effective countermeasures. Most lost everything before they understood what was happening." After the federal agents departed with Richard, a weighted silence settled over the dining room. My team remained respectfully quiet, allowing me space to process the magnitude of what we'd uncovered and the implications of Richard's connection to a larger criminal enterprise. "Well," I finally said, surveying the home I'd nearly lost, "I believe we still have a scheduled meeting with Agent Dawson at 10 a.m. Her arrival here simply accelerated our timeline. Do you want to return to the Four Seasons to rest before continuing?" Helen asked, her medical concern evident. "No," I decided, drawing strength from the familiar surroundings that represented everything I'd protected. "I think it's time I properly came home." The justice component unfolded with methodical precision over the following weeks, a complex machinery of legal consequences and financial reclamation that transformed Richard's betrayal from personal trauma into systematic dismantling of his entire scheme. From my gradually reclaimed home at Willow Creek Lane, I orchestrated and witnessed the unspooling of his carefully constructed deception, each revelation adding new dimensions to both the betrayal and my response. 14 days after Richard's detention by federal authorities, I sat in what had once been our shared home office, now reconfigured to accommodate my recovery needs while maintaining my ability to oversee both Archer Investments and the ongoing investigation. The antique partner's desk that had belonged to my father now held 3 monitors, one displaying Archer's performance metrics, one showing the status of asset recovery efforts, and one dedicated to the expanding federal case against what was now officially designated the Hargrove Network. "The plea negotiations have stalled," Mira reported, entering with her customary brisk efficiency and setting a leather portfolio on the desk. Richard's attorneys attempted to leverage his cooperation for reduced charges, but the FBI found his information less valuable than anticipated. Apparently, Brielle Parker has been significantly more forthcoming. "Not surprising," I noted, reviewing the latest documentation. Richard always maintained unnecessary compartmentalization, a habit I once attributed to professional discretion, but now recognize as calculated information control. "The federal prosecutor is offering one final opportunity for a cooperation agreement," Mira continued. "After that, they proceed with the full slate of charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, attempted theft of assets, forged documentation, and potential charges related to the medical aspects once that investigation concludes." I considered this information dispassionately, weighing justice against pragmatism. "What's your assessment of potential sentencing without cooperation?" "Minimum 8 years based on comparable cases," Mira replied without hesitation. "The financial crimes alone carry substantial penalties, and the aggravating factors, targeting during medical vulnerability, the extended pattern of deception, would likely push sentencing toward the upper ranges." The magnitude of consequences seemed simultaneously appropriate and surreal. The man who had shared my home potentially spending the next decade in federal custody. Yet the clinical facts of the case file couldn't fully capture the personal dimensions of betrayal that continued to unfold through ongoing investigation. Eliza arrived with the morning's additional updates, her tablet displaying newly organized information from Devon's forensic analysis. "The financial recovery is proceeding ahead of schedule," she reported. 94% of diverted assets have been located and frozen pending court orders for return. The remaining 6% appears to have been used for operational expenses, hotels, travel arrangements, documentation costs. "And the personal items from the storage facilities?" I asked, particularly concerned about my father's first editions and my grandmother's watch collection. "All recovered and undergoing authentication and condition verification," Eliza confirmed. "The initial assessment suggests everything is intact, though some items show evidence of preparation for international transport. This detail caught my attention. International? I thought Miami was their destination. Apparently just a waypoint, Eliza explained, bringing up shipping documentation on her tablet. We've uncovered arrangements for forwarding the most valuable items to a property in Montenegro, a country with particularly favorable banking secrecy and limited extradition provisions. The revelation added another layer to Richard's deception. Even his escape plan had contained hidden components unknown to Brielle. The calculated depth of his duplicity continued to unfold like a poisonous flower, each petal revealing new dimensions of betrayal. "There's something else," Eliza added, her tone shifting to indicate the personal nature of what followed. Devon recovered additional data from Richard's cloud storage, including correspondence with Jason Hargrove dating back nearly 10 years. The timeline implications struck me immediately. "Before we met," Eliza nodded, visibly uncomfortable with what she needed to share. "The earliest communications discuss target profiles for what they termed long-position acquisitions. Your name appears in these discussions approximately 3 months before you and Richard were introduced at the Charleston Foundation Gala. Though I had intellectually accepted the possibility that our entire relationship had been predicated on eventual theft, the concrete evidence created a hollowness that momentarily overwhelmed my strategic focus. 9 years of shared life, vacations, holiday celebrations, quiet evenings discussing future plans, all potentially calculated steps in a decade-long deception. "Mrs. Montgomery," Helen interjected from her monitoring position near the window, recognizing the physiological signs of distress I'd become adept at concealing. "Perhaps we should continue this briefing after a short rest period." "No," I replied firmly, drawing on the same resilience that had built my company from my father's modest inheritance. "This information, however difficult, is essential to complete understanding. Please continue, Eliza." With visible reluctance, Eliza displayed the recovered correspondence on the main monitor. The clinical, almost anthropological tone Richard and Hargrove used when discussing potential acquisitions created a dissociative distance that paradoxically made the content more digestible. They had assessed my financial holdings, family connections, or notable lack thereof following my father's death, and psychological profile with the detached precision of scientists categorizing specimens, my workaholic tendencies, and emotional compartmentalization had been noted as particularly advantageous characteristics, likely to facilitate extended absences and reduced scrutiny of financial matters. My dedication to honoring my father's memory by building Archer Investments had been flagged as an exploitable motivation leverage point that would keep me focused on business rather than domestic concerns. They documented everything, I observed, with clinical detachment that belied the emotional impact. My routines, preferences, vulnerabilities, all cataloged for systematic exploitation. "The level of premeditation significantly strengthens the federal case," Mira noted, her professional assessment offering a concrete anchor amid the emotional turmoil this revelation created. This transforms the narrative from opportunistic fraud to targeted predation, which carries substantially heavier penalties. I absorbed this information in measured silence, allowing myself to process both the personal betrayal and the strategic implications. When I finally spoke, my voice carried the same resolved clarity that had guided Archer through market turbulence. "I want complete documentation of every aspect of this scheme," I instructed. "Not just for legal proceedings, but for a comprehensive understanding of how these operations target and exploit successful individuals. There are patterns here that others should be aware of. Warning signs I missed that might protect potential victims." The doorbell interrupted our discussion, announcing Agent Dawson's arrival for our scheduled update meeting. The FBI's investigation had expanded significantly since Richard's initial detention, uncovering a network extending beyond Hargrove to include legal professionals, medical practitioners, and financial facilitators across multiple states. "Mrs. Montgomery," Agent Dawson greeted me with professional respect as she entered the office. "You're looking considerably improved since our last meeting." "Recovery progresses on multiple fronts," I acknowledged, gesturing toward the chair, positioned across from my desk. "I understand there have been significant developments in the broader investigation." "Indeed," she confirmed, opening her briefcase to retrieve a sealed file folder. "Based partly on documentation your team provided, we've identified 7 additional victims of the Hargrove network, all following remarkably similar patterns. Successful professionals with minimal family connections, targeted through romantic relationships that culminated in asset theft during periods of manufactured vulnerability." "Manufactured vulnerability," I repeated, the phrase crystallizing something I'd been processing. "You believe my medical situation was deliberately orchestrated rather than opportunistically exploited?" Agent Dawson's expression confirmed the darker implications we'd been uncovering. "The pattern across cases shows striking similarity. In each instance, the target experienced a health crisis requiring extended recovery, creating the perfect window for asset liquidation and disappearance by the perpetrator." "And Dr. Lowell?" I pressed, referring to the surgeon who had insisted on the most invasive approach to my spinal condition. "We've executed search warrants for his financial records and communications," Agent Dawson replied. "Preliminary findings show payments from shell companies connected to Hargrove, disguised as consulting fees. In at least 3 other cases, Hargrove Network associates directed targets to medical professionals who recommended unnecessarily aggressive treatments. The calculated nature of this exploitation, reaching into the sacred trust of medical care, created a new dimension of horror that transcended my personal experience. This wasn't merely financial fraud, but a systematic weaponization of vulnerability that endangered lives while stealing livelihoods." "The insurance policies," I said, recalling the amended coverage Richard had arranged before my surgery, "were those present in other cases as well?" "In 5 of the 7 cases we've documented," Agent Dawson confirmed grimly. "Increased coverage, modified exclusion clauses, always with the perpetrator as sole beneficiary. While we haven't established definitive evidence of intent regarding worst-case scenarios, the pattern suggests preparation for multiple potential outcomes." The implication hung in the air with chilling clarity. Richard and his associates had constructed a scheme that would profit them whether their targets survived medical crises or not. The life insurance modifications represented not just fraud, but a morally bankrupt contingency that transformed opportunistic theft into something approaching premeditated elimination. "I'd like to meet them," I said after processing this information. "The other victims?" Agent Dawson seemed surprised by this request. "That's highly unusual during an active investigation." "Not as witnesses," I clarified. "As survivors who might benefit from shared experience and collective response. Each person targeted by this network has lost something beyond financial assets: trust, security, their sense of agency during vulnerability. Recovering those intangible elements requires more than legal proceedings." The FBI agent considered this perspective with thoughtful attention. "I can't facilitate direct contact during the investigation phase, but once charges are formally filed, victim services could potentially coordinate a voluntary support network with appropriate confidentiality provisions." "Please explore that possibility," I requested. In my experience, reconstructing after betrayal benefits from understanding the systematic nature of what occurred rather than processing it as random misfortune. Our discussion continued with updates on asset recovery efforts, pending charges against various network members, and the expanding investigation into medical professionals who had potentially compromised patient care for financial gain. Throughout, I maintained the composed exterior that had become both professional habit and personal protection, though the magnitude of the scheme, and my unwitting role within it, continued to create moments of profound dissonance. As Agent Dawson prepared to depart, She hesitated at the office doorway. "Mrs. Montgomery, in my 17 years investigating financial crimes, I've rarely encountered someone who responded to victimization with your level of strategic clarity. Most people in your situation remain paralyzed by the personal betrayal, unable to engage effectively with the systemic aspects of their experience." "I've had exceptional guidance," I replied, thinking of my father's lessons in resilience and strategic thinking, and the advantage of professional resources most victims lack. "Which is precisely why your perspective could be valuable to others who've been targeted," she noted. "The Hargrove Network specifically selected accomplished individuals with substantial resources. Your example demonstrates how those same resources can be redirected toward recovery and accountability." After she departed, I remained at my father's desk, contemplating the dual nature of what had occurred: a deeply personal betrayal, embedded within a clinically calculated criminal enterprise. The tension between these dimensions created a complicated grief that conventional recovery narratives couldn't adequately address. Eliza returned with afternoon updates, her efficiency tempered by evident concern for my well-being following the morning's difficult revelations. "The art authentication reports have arrived," she reported, setting the portfolio on my desk. "Everything appears intact, though the Rothko lithograph shows evidence of preparation for remounting, likely to disguise its provenance for potential resale." "Has Marcus completed the property assessment?" I asked, referring to the structural evaluation of Willow Creek Lane we'd initiated after discovering Richard's systematic neglect of maintenance issues, another element of his exit strategy that had potentially compromised the house's structural integrity. "Comprehensive report expected tomorrow," Eliza confirmed. "Preliminary findings indicate several deferred maintenance issues requiring attention, particularly in the foundation support systems and roof infrastructure. Nothing catastrophic, but concerning given the property's historic status." I nodded, mentally calculating the renovation timeline this would require. "Please ask him to prioritize the structural elements first, then the security upgrades we discussed. The aesthetic renovations can wait until those essential systems are addressed." "Of course," Eliza agreed, then hesitated before adding, "There's one more thing. Devin found something you should see regarding the Santorini trip." The reference to our vacation 3 years ago immediately captured my attention. The photograph from that trip, Richard and me against the backdrop of the brilliant blue Aegean, had been among the items he'd carefully packed during his hasty departure, a detail that had struck me as incongruously sentimental amid his calculated theft. "What? About Santorini?" I prompted when Eliza seemed reluctant to continue. "Financial records indicate Richard maintained separate accommodations during that trip," she explained, displaying the documentation on her tablet. "A second villa on the opposite side of the island, booked under the name Richard Matthews. Credit: card receipts show meals, excursions, and purchases for 2 people during periods when you believed he was attending conference calls or business meetings. The revelation shouldn't have held power after everything else we'd uncovered, yet this particular betrayal, contaminating memories I'd treasured as genuine connections amid our busy lives, created a sharper pain than I'd anticipated." The Santorini trip had represented a rare period of undivided attention from Richard, a time I'd believed we'd reconnected amid career demands and social obligations. "There's more," Eliza continued reluctantly. "The second person appears to have been Brielle Parker, based on cross-referenced social media posts from that period showing her at identical locations, though carefully avoiding photographing Richard or identifying her companion. The calculated nature of this deception, maintaining parallel vacations while I believed we were strengthening our marriage, illuminated the comprehensive falsity Richard had constructed. Not content with financial exploitation, he had methodically manufactured emotional experiences designed to reinforce my trust while simultaneously betraying it. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly, accepting the tablet to review the evidence. "Myself. This information belongs in the complete documentation we're assembling." After Eliza departed, I found myself studying the financial records that tracked Richard's movements during our Santorini trip, the calculated allocation of time between his official vacation with me and his shadow holiday with Brielle. The precision of his scheduling reflected the same strategic thinking I applied to investment acquisitions, a disturbing parallel that highlighted how thoroughly he had commodified our relationship. Yet amid the continuing revelations of betrayal, I recognized an unexpected clarity emerging, a profound understanding that what had been taken from me was not what I had most valued. The house remained mine, now legally owned through my company rather than personal holding. The art, the heirlooms, the financial assets, all were being systematically recovered and secured. What had been irretrievably lost was an illusion I had maintained. The belief that my marriage, whatever its limitations, had been founded on genuine connection rather than calculated exploitation. This loss, while painful, also represented a form of truth that enabled more authentic reconstruction than continued deception would have allowed. As twilight settled over Willow Creek Lane, casting long shadows across the garden where my grandmother's roses still bloomed with persistent vigor, I made a decision that would shape the next phase of recovery. Richard's betrayal had been systematic and comprehensive, designed to dismantle everything I had built. My response would be equally comprehensive, but constructive rather than destructive, using the painful clarity his deception had created to build something stronger than what had existed before. The Hargrove network had identified and exploited successful individuals isolated by achievement and minimal family connections. The most effective countermeasure to such exploitation wasn't just legal consequences for perpetrators, but strengthened connections among potential targets, a network of mutual protection and shared wisdom that transformed isolation into collective resilience. I reached for my phone and composed a message to Mira. When the FBI clears communication with other victims, I want to establish a foundation focused on education, prevention, and recovery related to targeted financial exploitation. Please research structural models that would allow maximum impact while maintaining appropriate privacy protections. The response came almost immediately. Already drafting concepts. The Montgomery Initiative has a fitting symmetry, reclaiming the name they attempted to weaponize against you. I considered this suggestion, appreciating the symbolic reclamation while recognizing that true transformation required moving beyond personal narrative toward collective protection. The Resilience Network might better capture the essence of what we're building, I suggested instead. This isn't about my story. It's about changing the vulnerability patterns that made all of us targets. As night descended fully over Willow Creek Lane, I remained at my father's desk, surrounded by evidence of betrayal yet increasingly focused on the reconstruction that would follow. Richard and his associates had calculated that my isolation would facilitate their exploitation. They hadn't anticipated that this same independence would fuel a systematic response that transformed personal betrayal into collective protection. This house around me, nearly stolen yet ultimately secured through my own company's intervention, seemed to embody this transformation. What had been targeted for theft was now becoming the foundation for something stronger and more significant than what had existed before the betrayal. The meaningful transformation came full circle exactly 1 year after my emergency surgery. As I stood on the newly renovated terrace of Willow Creek Lane, watching guests arrive for the official launch of the Resilience Network. The Tudor mansion, now fully restored with strengthened foundations and updated security systems, had been repurposed as the organization's headquarters, its historic architecture symbolizing how damaged structures could be preserved and reinforced, rather than abandoned. Dr. Anita Patel arrived first, accompanied by her sister Mira, whose legal expertise had been instrumental in drafting the protective frameworks now being implemented by financial institutions nationwide. They were followed by Marcus, recently promoted to Chief Strategic Officer at Archer Investments, and Devin, who had left forensic accounting to head the network's financial pattern recognition division. More significant were the 6 other attendees, who arrived in quick succession, the fellow survivors of the Hargrove network whom I'd first met 3 months earlier during Richard's sentencing hearing. Each had lost significant assets and endured profound betrayal, yet each had also demonstrated remarkable resilience in rebuilding their lives. Together, we had transformed individual victimization into collective protection, developing educational programs, financial safeguards, and support systems for those targeted by similar schemes. Quite a transformation, observed Eleanor Winters, a neurosurgeon whose experience mirrored mine in disturbing detail, right down to the unnecessarily invasive medical procedures that had facilitated theft during her recovery, from nearly losing this place to making it the center of a national protection network. The symmetry feels appropriate, I replied, watching as staff prepared the garden for our formal announcement. Using what they tried to take from us to protect others from similar experiences. The Resilience Network had already identified 14 potential targeting operations across the country, providing early intervention that disrupted schemes before significant damage occurred. Our combination of financial forensics, legal expertise, and personal experience created protection mechanisms that conventional security systems couldn't match, because we understood the predatory patterns from the inside. As the evening's formal program began, I took my place at the podium, supported by a walking cane that represented both ongoing physical recovery and hard-won stability. The assembled audience, financial professionals, medical ethicists, law enforcement representatives, and media, grew quiet as I surveyed them with the composed authority that had become my public signature. Sophisticated predators succeed by isolating their targets, I began, speaking without notes. They identify successful individuals with minimal protective networks, exploit those vulnerabilities through manufactured trust, then extract assets during periods of created crisis. The Hargrove network demonstrated this pattern with clinical precision across multiple states and dozens of victims. I paused, allowing the scope of this predation to register before continuing. Their fundamental miscalculation was believing that individuals targeted for their independence would remain isolated in the aftermath of betrayal. Instead, we have built connections that transform individual vulnerability into collective resilience.